Hello, class, and welcome to the second video in my agency lecture series. This is part one because the first video is part zero. In these videos, our plan is to go over the history of agency and autonomy. In the first video, I introduced some of the history and gave a sort of big picture view of my approach to the topic, and we talked about the timeline of philosophy. We're going to go a little deeper into the history today. We're going to talk a little bit more about Aristotle today. But the basic goal in this series is to introduce the historical context for a lot of debates that arise over agency and autonomy, and to give a sort of big picture overview so that we can have some tools on hand to deal with some a little more detailed problems like the problem of free will or issues around AI and robotics like can machines think. So in this first lecture series, we're setting up these debate topics so that we can engage them later on in the semester. In the first video, I introduced this table and I sort of talked a little bit about my approach. We're going to be going over the course of these videos through the first, in the agency series, we're going to go through the first of these three views. And then later on, when we talk about AI, we'll go over the Turing view. We're only going to do the highlighted views on this table. And this first video will focus mostly on ancient views, which I'm calling the Silk Road philosophical views. And we'll talk a lot about Aristotle's metaphysics and his view of what it means to be a living organism. Check out the first video for a little bit more discussion of this big table. But the plan for this video is to focus on the Silk Road philosophy, to talk a little bit about humorism and the precursors to Aristotle's view, and then to talk more directly about Aristotle's metaphysics, so his view on actual and potential substances, this theory of essentialism, and teleology, and some other of Aristotle's views. I'll explain what all these words mean over the course of this video, hopefully. Just to give a little bit more context of our discussion here, so let me get my head out of the way. In the ancient Greek tradition, the conversation usually centers around Socrates and Plato, maybe Plato more than anyone else. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates never really wrote anything down, but Plato wrote a lot of things down. And then Aristotle was one of Plato's students. So the line from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle is sort of the center of Greek philosophy. I went a little bit over this in the first video, but also in the Greek tradition, there were a lot of philosophers before and well before Socrates. These are the so-called pre-Socratics. But there were also a lot of philosophy being done in India and in China. Confucius and the Buddha are both doing their work around 500 BC. Aristotle's a little bit late in this, the 300 BC. And there's this big boom, like I said in the other video, of these ancient philosophical views around 500 BC that the Greek tradition is only one piece of, and is actually a fairly late piece. So I want to just set a little bit of this context before we dive into Aristotle. As I said in the other video, human civilization goes back much further than this, 10,000 years before this, and thousands of years before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, people are already building very complicated civilizations with very elaborate religious and metaphysical views of how the world works, how it all sort of fits together. And these views play out most directly in views of medicine and what it means to be healthy and how to keep people healthy or how to stop people from being sick. So you see sort of these early precursor views in, for instance, ancient Egypt, 5,000 years before Aristotle's writing, where there's already this very elaborate religious system with a hierarchy of gods and different gods controlling different aspects of the environment, and then also different demons in the body controlling different bodily processes and bodily functions. And part of being healthy on this view is to make sure that all of the demons are performing their performing their process correctly, and that they're happy and satisfied, and all of the gods are appeased, and keeping the balance of these gods and demons in a balanced state is part of what medicine and health is about on this ancient worldview. Zooming ahead much closer to Aristotle, but still maybe 1,000 years before Aristotle, you have developed metaphysical frameworks in both China and India. In China, for instance, there's a framework that recognizes a set of elements, the basic 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And these 5 elements are not just the constitutive properties of the world, but they also are used to explain things like health and sickness. Having an imbalance of these elements, having too much earth in the body, would lead to certain kinds of sicknesses and diseases and so on. In addition to these elements, which are sort of the material constitution of the universe, there's also this vital force, chi, that goes through everything and connects everything. It's what makes living creatures alive, but it's also what connects those living creatures to the rest of the universe. And so you have this universe composed of these elements and then bound together with this vital force, vital process. This is already alive and well in ancient China, 1,000 years before Aristotle. Maybe a little bit more recent than that is the ancient Indian view, which has also an elemental theory: earth, air, fire, and water, and space. Notice that metal and wood are unique to the Chinese theory. These views are not exactly in parallel. There are differences, but in broad brushstrokes, they have these similarities. They're elemental theories. The material constituents of the universe boil down to these basic elements. And then there's a vital force that connects them all. In ancient Indian view, this is a prana, which is this vital force that makes living things alive and conscious things conscious, but also connects them to the rest of the universe. The Indian view also introduces what they call the humors. And the humors are these vital fluids. So for instance, wind, bile, and phlegm. And the idea is that being alive partly involves breathing and moving wind back and forth through the body. And so wind is supposed to be this vital force, or this vital humor. So the humors here has nothing to do with being funny or being or comedy. This has to do with the vital fluids that keep living things alive. So the wind is one of these fluids. Bile and phlegm are more of these humors, these vital fluids. Now, I'm not an expert in ancient Chinese or ancient Indian theory. If this is your expertise, if you have some background in this, in these views, or if you want to do research on these views, I'd love to learn anything you can teach me. I sort of just have a very superficial knowledge of this stuff. But I do, even from this sort of superficial position, want to characterize some of the general features of these ancient elemental theories. They all boil down to this sort of elemental view of the universe, that everything's made of some set of elements and that are connected with this vital force. And a characteristic of these ancient theories is this idea that health and well-being involves striking a balance of these elements and these vital forces, or these humors. And so you're healthy when these humors are balanced, and you're unhealthy or you're ill, you're sick when there's some imbalance. And so not only does this explain why people get unhealthy, thousands of years before we understand anything about germs or other kinds of biological diseases. So this idea of balance is supposed to explain why people are healthy or unhealthy, but it's also supposed to recommend a treatment. You can make someone who's sick well again by rebalancing the forces, by introducing new elements or otherwise balancing the forces. So this kind of view is not very popular with modern Western science. Modern Western science understands that this kind of balance is not all that matters to being healthy. Nevertheless, I want to say that this kind of view is still very popular among sort of the popular discourse, or the sort of common views of health, sort of naive or sometimes called folk views of health, involve this kind of balance logic, that what health is about striking the right balance in things. So for instance, you'll see cereals advertised as part of a balanced breakfast. And what does that mean? Well, supposedly it means that it has the right amount of vitamins and minerals for your daily nutritional needs. But the sort of subtext here is that a balanced breakfast is a healthy breakfast because it's balanced, and that being balanced in some ways just amounts to being healthy. And so I think this is still a very popular intuition in how people think about health and well-being. And so these intuitions survive even while the sort of science has changed quite radically. The image for this kind of balanced view is the yin yang symbol you see here, which comes from ancient Chinese philosophy. And the yin yang is supposed to be exactly this representation of a perfectly balanced system, where the light part of the circle uh, uh, exactly complements and sort of fits right into the dark part of the circle. So it's not that the light is better than the dark or the dark better than the light. It's not one triumphing over the other, but it's a sort of harmony of the system where they both fit into and complement each other. And so again, this is this ancient view of balance and harmony, and thinking about the world's operating in this sort of balancing or harmonious way leads to thinking about the world in these kinds of dualistic patterns. So good and bad, right? And the idea is that the world is this sort of harmonious balance of good and bad, or of life and death. So things die, yes, and that might be a bad thing, but the death allows for new growth and new life. And so there's this kind of balance on both sides, sickness and health. And you have these sort of dichotomies that kind of get taken away or sort of run away with, the difference between old and young, the dichotomy between man and woman. And these kinds of dichotomies are taken as part of the metaphysical structure of the universe. There's some sort of intrinsic balance to strike between being old and young, or being male or female, or being hot and cold, or wet and dry. Winter, summer, fall, spring. Right? The idea is that the world comes in these duals, and the duals get balanced. So winter is the extreme cold, but then summer is this extreme hot, and the seasons are balanced because they flow between these extremes. Okay, so this is very rough caricature of these ancient worldviews of how the sort of naive metaphysics of the universe operates in these sort of brute dichotomies that balance themselves out. And again, this isn't just a religious view sort of abstractly about how the world works, or sort of spiritually about how the world works, but it's also supposed to be first explanatory, like why does the world work this way? Well, you can explain it in terms of these balancing forces, but also what do we do about it? How do we act on a world that works this way? If you understand what the balance is supposed to be, then it tells you what to do in order to achieve that balance. Right? This is the idea. Okay, so that's very rough brushstrokes, but the point here is to say that the Greek worldviews and the Greek metaphysics, especially the metaphysics of Aristotle, is not unique to the Greek tradition, but in fact long predates any of the Greek philosophers that we're talking about. These are views that are sort of embedded in the Silk Road and all of the communities across the ancient world, from China all the way through the Mediterranean, that were connected by trade routes and by communities talking to each other and trading around these ideas. So by the time Aristotle is developing these ideas, 300 BC, they've already been around a lot, and people already know them well, and it's sort of in the popular discourse. What Aristotle does is not come up with these ideas from scratch. What he does is try to formalize and systematize the existing popular views. So on the Greek view, you have something that seems very clearly inherited from the Indian tradition. And in fact, we know that certain philosophers and important Greek thinkers visited India and then came back and talked about everything they learned. So a lot of these Greek views are inherited from the Indian tradition. So elements are the same as in the Indian, ancient Indian views: earth, air, fire, and water. There's also ether, which is supposed to be space, which is supposed to be like the celestial realm. So the sun and the moon and the stars are made of ether, whereas earth, air, fire, and water are on earth. The Greeks elaborated on the humorous theory of these vital fluids. So for the Greeks, there were 4 basic fluids, and these 4 fluids actually corresponded to each of the 5 elements. So blood was associated with air, and phlegm was associated with water, earth was associated with black bile, and fire with yellow bile. So bile is the fluid that like your liver makes, your gallbladder makes. Phlegm is like your lungs making, and then blood is of course running through your veins. And the idea is that each of these fluids is really a representation of each of the elements. And so balancing of the fluids is again balancing of these elements. And in fact, on the Greek view, and maybe to some extent the Indian tradition, these basic elements bottom out in an even more basic dichotomy, and this is the dichotomy between hot and cold and between wet and dry. So each of the elements represent one combination here. So wet and cold are opposites. I'm sorry. Hot and cold are opposites. Wet and dry are opposites. So you could have something that's both hot and dry, which would be like fire, and that's the yellow bile. Or you can have something that's both wet and cold, like water, which is phlegm, or wet and hot, which is air and blood, or dry and cold, which is black bile and earth. Right. And so the idea is that there's these basic dichotomies, and the basic dichotomies result in this combination of elements, and the elements themselves build up into all the things that exist, and also tell you how those things are doing, whether something's healthy or sick or not. So this was humorism. Humorism is the idea that you can practice medicine, that you can do the work of a doctor by managing these bodily fluids. So, for instance, if someone was sick in a particular way, someone was sanguine. The diagnosis was someone who's sanguine had an excess of blood in their body. And the solution to this, the treatment for someone who's sanguine, is to let some of that blood out. So ancient medical practice would have things like bloodletting, where you'd go to the doctor because you were sick for some reason, and then the doctor, what they would do, they would slice open a vein and drain a bunch of blood. And the idea was exactly, well, you have too much blood, or your blood is too hot, and we need to cool you down. So by letting some blood out, or by cooling your blood down. This stuff is very popular, and it survives in modern language. If someone is called hot-blooded, or if you describe someone as being hot-blooded, I think most of you in class, or especially the native English speakers, should have a sense of what that means. Someone who's hot-blooded is easily angered, is easy to irritate, is maybe very, very mad. Being hot-blooded is someone who's mad and angry, and we derive that analogy from exactly this ancient humorous theory, where hot blood is part of how you become angry. And so the treatment for someone who's too angry is to let some of the blood out or cool some of the blood down. Let me do one more of these because they're fun. So the black bile, in Greek, black is melon and bile is colic. So black bile is melancholic, or melancholy. So you might know the term melancholy from English. Melancholy means someone who's sad or depressed. And the reason we have this term melancholy is from the ancient Greek black bile, because black bile is one of these humors, one of these physical humors that comes from the spleen. And if you have too much black bile in your body, then you end up depressed. So let me say for posterity that, of course, this theory is wrong. This is not what depression or anger, it's not how depression or anger work. It's not that there's too much of some fluid in your body, and what you need to do is balance out the fluids. A lot of people used to think this, and it's still baked into our language, how we think about and talk about things like mental illness. And in fact, you might start questioning what you hear people say about mental states, or things like being happy or sad, and notice how much people think about these in hydraulic terms, as how much fluid you have of some sort in your body. I think you'll notice that this kind of conversation ends up sneaking its way into the discourse, either deliberately, explicitly, or through the metaphors that we use. So again, I'm not endorsing humorism as a viable medical theory at all. This stuff has been more than adequately disproven, but it survived a very long time. So this view of medicinal practice survived at least until the 1850s. Most scientists before the 1850s were pretty sure that it was not a good theory, but it was still very widely believed and practiced, this kind of humoristic theory, until 150 or under 200 years ago. So these things, I'm going to be talking about them as if they're an ancient worldview, as if they're from a long time ago, but really, in fact, they're not. In fact, this stuff is baked into how people have been thinking about health and medicine and agency for thousands of years. And that sort of long historical practice doesn't just go away with a few neat experiments. It's so deeply ingrained in our language, in our metaphors, in our narratives, that it's hard to um, it's hard to uh, 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 it's hard to disengage all of that at once. Anyway, so the humorous theory in ancient Greece has these basic elements, has these humors, also has a vital force connecting all things. In Greek, this is pneuma, which is heat. And so the idea is that there's a heat. There's a prana, by the way, from the Indian worldview is breath. The Indian view, talking about prana as breath, sort of makes sense because living things breathe, and so something's alive. Like one way of checking if something's alive is by checking if it's still breathing. And so there's this sort of recognition. And similarly for the Greek view that the vital force involves heat, making sure that it's still warm is to make sure that it's still alive. Right. So again, all of this isn't just sort of religious hogwash. This is meant to be an explanatory and an active practical theory for how to deal with certain kinds of especially medical issues. Okay, so this is the Greek view. This isn't just Aristotle's view. This predates Aristotle's, not only just Aristotle, but all of Greek culture by like 1,000 years. But Aristotle himself inherits this from a line of thinkers who developed this in some detail. Empedocles comes up with the whole framework of the four elements in this sort of hot, dry, cold, wet framework. Hippocrates, from the Hippocratic Oath, applied a lot of this humorous medicine theory to medicine, to medicinal practice, and to explaining how doctors should behave towards their patients. And so this is sort of at the very beginning of professional medical practices, is Greek humorism. And Aristotle inherits these views from earlier traditions and then elaborates on them and sort of systematizes it in more elaborate ways, and especially works it together with the physics and political theory. After Aristotle, others take up his view and expand on it further. Galen significantly expands and updates the view and makes it more practical for working doctors. And then, if you remember from my first video, there's sort of a fall of ancient Greek theory in Europe and the rise of Greek scholarship and in the Islamic world. So Ibn Sina is an Islamic scholar who, during the Islamic Golden Age, develops this sort of Aristotelian idea into what became the Unani tradition. And these traditions last a long time. This, again, is considered the sort of popular default medicine of the day. This is what the credible doctors of the time would practice. This is how they understood how the body worked, how the world worked, and how to treat different illnesses through this sort of elemental framework. The elemental framework starts to lose popularity at the beginning of the scientific revolution, but it doesn't get definitively ruled out until very late in the scientific revolution. 1958 is when Darwin is working. So this stuff sticks around not just in medicine and physiology, but even in mental health. These ideas stick around much even later than 1858. So this stuff, it's not a lot. These theories are not alive and well, but they're embedded in the discourse, and they're worth being aware of so that we understand how the discourse works. Like I said earlier, so here's the fall of Rome and the Islamic Golden Age, and this is where a lot of the ancient views are elaborated and systematized. And these views last for 1,000 years until the scientific revolution in the early 1600s, late 1500s, early 1600s. So this is all the context in which Aristotle's working. And we're going to dive into Aristotle's views in particular, but I know a lot of students in this class have not taken a philosophy class before. So I kind of want to do just a little introduction to the history of philosophy, the sort of standard introduction to the history of philosophy, which unfortunately tends to ignore the Chinese and Indian traditions that came before it, and suggests that maybe philosophy starts with the Greeks, and with this in particular. So this is a famous fresco believe it's in the Vatican. This is Raphael's School of Athens. This is the School of Athens, and if you know a philosophy major in college, they probably have this image on their wall, and they can tell you who all the different philosophers are. So all of the important or well-known philosophers from the ancient world are represented in this image, and maybe most obviously is Plato and Aristotle in the center. But the tradition usually starts with Socrates. So here's Socrates from the School of Athens picture. Let me actually go back here. Socrates is over here. You can see the person he's talking to is not particularly impressed with what Socrates is saying. But here's Socrates. Socrates was famously ugly, was not an attractive person. And for the Greeks who valued beauty so much, Nietzsche says that Socrates being ugly was a refutation in itself. But Socrates makes a name for himself by being a rabble rouser, by being nowadays you'd call it a sea lion. But Socrates liked making arguments, and he liked making arguments that showed really powerful people who were. He liked to go to powerful people who were well known for their intelligence, for their rationality, for their oratory ability, their ability to give like a convincing speech. And what Socrates liked to do is go up to these people and ask them questions, and simple questions, but questions that they would increasingly find difficult to answer, or that when they answered it, it would contradict something that they had said just a few minutes earlier. And in the course of asking these questions, Socrates would show that these famous thinkers really didn't know what they were talking about, or really weren't committed to what they were talking about, and in some sense were maybe just making things up. So Socrates liked to go to these famous intellectuals, the so-called sophists, and prove that they were a lot of hot air, that they didn't really know what they were talking about, that people were taking them more seriously and treating them as more intelligent than they actually were. These intellectuals that Socrates attacked, these are the sophists. So Sophia in ancient Greece, the word Sophia means wisdom. So the sophists were the wise guys. Philosophers, philosophia. Philo is the Greek word for love. So the philosophers are the lovers of wisdom, but the sophists were the wise guys. Sophists were people who were known for being smart. In ancient Greece, the sophists were basically like lawyers. They would make arguments for you in public. In Athens, it was a democracy. You could go make your case. Everyone had to serve in the Senate, or all the landowning males had to serve in the Senate. And so it was a sort of democratic forum, and sometimes you would need a case argued for you in the Senate, some criminal situation, and you want to make a good case in front of the Senate, and so you'd hire a sophist to come argue your case in front of the Senate, because the sophists were known for being very intelligent and they could make these cases very well, and so you would hire these people to make an argument for you. And the thing that Socrates didn't like is that the sophists really weren't committed to anything. If you paid them enough, they would argue whatever case you wanted. And that means that they would sometimes argue contradictory cases. So like maybe 1 week, a sophist gets hired to argue that murder is wrong, murder is the highest crime, and this person who committed murder should themselves be put to death. And then the very next week, someone else hires that very same sophist to argue that murder is not the most serious crime, and there could be nothing worse than putting someone to death, and maybe we shouldn't hold this person to such high standards. In other words, the sophists would argue positions and then argue the exact opposite of that position. As long as you paid them enough, it didn't really seem to matter to any of these sophists what positions they were arguing for, because they could make a convincing and motivating argument on either side of any position. So Socrates' idea was that these sophists had no real philosophical commitments. So by going up to these sophists and asking them these questions that showed how their views were all jumbled up and self-contradictory, and to reveal that these sophists were fools, is to undermine this sort of sophist practice of not having any commitments to the truth. Socrates, and maybe even more so Plato, contrasted themselves with the sophists. As philosophers, they were committed to the truth. They were the lovers of wisdom. They weren't merely smart and clever. They weren't merely wise, but they loved wisdom and they wanted to pursue the truth. And that means not just making any argument that was convenient. That means not just making any argument that you get paid to make. It means really having a commitment to the truth. And so here's Socrates in the School of Athens in Raphael's fresco, enumerating something. He's counting off a list. Here's another rendition of Socrates. This is called The Death of Socrates. It's a famous painting. Because Socrates, you keep making a fool of these very famous, rich, powerful people. They're eventually not going to like it, and eventually someone got sick of Socrates' bullshit and tried him for corrupting the youth. Charged him with corrupting the youth. Said that Socrates was trying to convince kids that the gods didn't exist, and this was considered a crime. And Socrates was charged with it, and he went to a trial. The charge wasn't true. Socrates was not an atheist, and he wasn't trying to convince the children that gods didn't exist. He was getting popular with the kids, with the young people. People started to like he was sort of a character in ancient Athens. People would see him coming to these parties, and they would, oh no, Socrates is here. He's going to make someone look like an idiot. And so the old sophists who were established and had a lot of money, they didn't like Socrates because they were being made to look foolish. But the sophists' kids, who were also at these parties, loved seeing the sophists being made of fools, and Socrates started gaining this following. In fact, this is how he kept getting invited to these big parties, is because one of the sophists' kids would invite him into these parties, and so he started gaining this following, and someone had enough and charged Socrates with corrupting the youth, and Socrates goes in front of the court. And instead of pleading innocent and arguing against his charges, he accepts the charges. And he says, "Okay, well, if Greece doesn't want me, then I'm going to leave." So he accepts the charges, and he gets sentenced to be put to death by drinking the hemlock. The hemlock's a poison. There's these dialogues that Plato writes of Socrates. Most of the dialogues are of Socrates going to these parties and harassing these sophists, but some of these dialogues are about the trial that Socrates goes into. The trial is called the Apology, and then there's a couple of events or dialogues that happen before and after the trial. And so this is one of the ones that happens immediately after the trial. This is the Phaedo, where Socrates is about to drink the hemlock, and he has this long discussion of what he imagines heaven's going to be like, and what he imagines is waiting for him in the afterlife. And then he ends up drinking the poison and killing himself. These are all his followers, who are you can see torn to pieces that Socrates is going to go, but Socrates himself is not scared. He's pointing up at the heavens with confidence, and he's ripped. So Socrates looks like this very confident, bold figure in history. Sort of, we can forget how ugly he is, maybe. And he has all these followers who are sort of wailing in agony of him leaving. Most of what we know of Socrates today comes from Plato. There's a couple of other ancient Greek sources that talk about Socrates that are contemporary to Socrates. But the only real, the biggest source that we have of the ancient Socrates is Plato. Socrates never wrote anything down himself. In some ways, he's like the Jesus of philosophy, where he doesn't write things down, but all his followers writes things down, and then he kills himself, and so there's the sacrifice and martyrship and so on. In the Phaedo, the dialogues, which Plato wrote, he also explains that Plato was not himself at this event. He was sick that day, and so he couldn't make it. And this, of course, gives Plato some freedom in his dialogues to talk about things that didn't really happen. To a large extent, the Socrates that we've inherited is really a caricature that Plato makes up. This is Plato here at the end of the bed. You can see Plato's not actually engaged with this, and it's almost as if this whole scenario is in Plato's mind because he's off to the side. But this is because Plato wasn't actually there. So in the dialogue, he writes himself out of the event. One other thing just to point out here, Socrates was married, and he had kids, but he also had a job. He was trained as a mason, as like a stone worker, but he wasn't very good at his job. He mostly skipped out on his job. He also wasn't a very good husband or father, and so you can see here that before Socrates drinks the hemlock, he sends his wife and kids out of the room because he wants to spend his last moments with his friends doing philosophy. And so he has no need for his wife and kids. So it gives you some sense of the kind of person that Socrates is, and nevertheless the esteem that the people around him give him. So this is Socrates, and he has this Socratic method of asking questions to try to get at the truth. But this is all comes to us from Plato. So this is in the center of the school of Athens. Here is Aristotle and Plato. Plato's the old one. Plato was Socrates' student, and he's the one who writes all these dialogues of Socrates. Most of what we have from Plato are dialogues of that Socrates had with other sophists. And Plato runs a school in ancient Athens called the Academy. This is why institutions of higher learning today are sometimes called the Academy. I'm called an academic because of Plato's Academy. And at Plato's Academy, they studied all sorts of things: geometry, astronomy, but they also studied things like gymnastics, wrestling. So this was sort of a comprehensive school, and Plato was the head of the school, and he wrote these dialogues partly as advertising for the school, as like, this is the kind of stuff we study here at the Academy. If you want to learn, if you want to be like Socrates, then come study at the Academy. And one of Plato's students who came to study at the Academy after Socrates was gone is Aristotle. In fact, Aristotle was Plato's star student, one of Plato's best students. And Aristotle thought that maybe Plato would leave the Academy to Aristotle to run after Plato dies, but Plato ends up leaving the Academy to another philosopher who to a different philosopher. And so Aristotle doesn't get it. So Aristotle goes off and starts his own school, the Lyceum. And eventually, when Aristotle's an old man, he's hired by Alexander the Great, when Alexander the Great is just a kid, to tutor him. So Aristotle lives a very privileged academic life around ancient Greece. And these are the two sort of core figures of ancient philosophy. Remember, Socrates is an important figure for Plato's dialogues, but Socrates wasn't the one that's writing these things. Plato is the one that's writing, and Socrates is really just a vehicle or a mouthpiece for Plato. So in the School of Athens fresco, we have Plato pointing up at the stars, up at the heavens, and he's carrying his Timaeus. And Timaeus is the dialogue where Socrates talks about the structure of the universe and of creation and the purpose of the universe. These sort of very high-minded, abstract themes, cosmological themes. And Plato here is contrasted with Aristotle young. And instead of pointing out at the heavens, Aristotle points out at the earth. And so the image here from the ancient world is that Plato is interested in the ideals, the abstract universals, these very abstract, high-minded dimensions of philosophy, whereas Aristotle is much more interested in the real world, in practical issues about how to live the good life, the nature of human reason, the nature of biology, how the world as a natural phenomenon works. And Aristotle is much less interested, although he talks about it quite a lot, but he's much less interested in the sort of cosmological, abstract, idealized views. Right. So Plato, the abstract philosopher, and Aristotle, the practical philosopher. Now, of course, this is all caricature and sort of overblown by this kind of historical discussion. Raphael's painting this image 1,000 years after Plato and Aristotle are alive, so he never knew them. Like, this is ancient history even for Raphael. So you can see how the sort of historical narratives around philosophy develop here. In an introductory philosophy class, people will talk a lot about Plato because these dialogues are they're really fun. Socrates is a very fun character, and some of the thought experiments and scenarios in the dialogues are very entertaining. Aristotle apparently wrote dialogues, but we don't have any of them from the ancient world. None of them survive. Instead, all we really have of Aristotle are his lecture notes. He ran a school, and so he lectured at the school, and we have the notes that he wrote and the notes that his students wrote about his lectures. And the lecture notes are a much more dry reading. They're very technical and detailed and sort of plottingly systematic. It's like reading a math textbook. And it doesn't have the sort of fun back and forth of the Platonic dialogues. Apparently, Aristotle's dialogues that he wrote were really good, but unfortunately, we don't have them. So all we have are these lecture notes, but the lecture notes are systematic and thorough, and he talks about everything. He talks about basic metaphysics, about how the universe works, about physics and motion and how things move. He talks about the entire scope of the biological world and how living things work and all the different kinds of living things. Effectively doing some of the first systematic taxonomies in science, and really setting a groundwork for how science operates for the next 1,000 or 1,500 years. Aristotle also develops the first systematic logical framework with his categorical logic. He also talks about ethics and politics. In fact, in the Raphael picture, while Plato's holding the Timaeus, Aristotle's holding his Nicomachean Ethics, which is about human reason and how to live a good life, and how and sort of the nature of political life for a human, like what it means to run a good city. So Aristotle's corpus runs across this huge range of scope, and the narrative that he tells is comprehensive, top to bottom, world historical. So this is where we're going to start. I'm going to lay out Aristotle's view in very broad brushstrokes as best I can. I talked already a little bit about the sort of rediscovery of Aristotle as ending the Dark Ages, right? The Dark Ages happen when the Greek. This isn't exactly right. This is again an oversimplified narrative, but the idea is that the Dark Ages happen when a Christian Europe refuses and makes illegal the study of the ancient Greek philosophers and the ancient Roman philosophers, the sort of pre-Christian Romans, and that blocking of the ancient worldview is part of what leads Europe into these Dark Ages. It's not exactly right to say that they're Dark Ages. There is work being done, but it's just not a lot of work, and it's not work being done to the same rigor and standards and with the same innovation as in earlier Rome and in ancient Greece. Instead, all of that work is done in the Islamic world, and there's huge treatises that come out of the Islamic world on religion and working at this sort of high-minded cosmological scale, but also significant advances in medicine and mathematics and logic out of the Islamic world. And then the Europeans try to take back the Holy Land in the Crusades, and they don't succeed, but because they interact with the Islamic world, they also find these important texts, the sort of textbooks that they're teaching from, and they take these books back to Europe, and the Europeans rediscover Aristotle, and this is part of what sets the European world into this sort of ancient fashion trend that ultimately culminates in the Renaissance. So this painting right here, I think this is Rembrandt. This is Aristotle with a bust of Homer. I think this is Rembrandt. This is much after the Renaissance, but sort of Europeans looking back on Aristotle and recognizing that he's an important historical figure for the development of science and culture in Europe. An important figure that wouldn't have been possible without Islamic scholars keeping his texts alive for 1,000 years. Okay. One more thing about sort of ancient Greek dichotomies before we get too deep into Aristotle's metaphysics is, and I mentioned this scrolling back, I mentioned this at the end of the Silk Road dualisms, is this idea that sort of reason and passion are fundamental opposite tensions in the universe. So this is maybe characteristic of not just Aristotle or Plato, but characteristic of the sort of Greek perspective, that on the one hand, human nature is rational, and by rational here we mean not just sort of brute logic. Computers aren't just purely rational. The idea is that rational means reasonable, that you act according to reasons, that you have reasons for why you act, for what you do, that you're not acting randomly or haphazardly, but that you have reasons. And not only do you have reasons, but you can think about those reasons and maybe come to better reasons. Right? So this is what we use our brains for, this rational capacity, in order to make good choices, in order to do the right thing. And part of the idea is that this is something sort of unique to humans, that animals act on instinct. Maybe they're smart in certain ways, but maybe they can't use reasons the way that humans can use reasons, that humans aren't rational. And that doesn't mean that humans aren't animals. And the ancient Greeks definitely believed that humans are animals. We're a kind of animal. And what distinguishes us from the rest of the animals is our rational capacities. So reason distinguishes humans as animals. So the rational capacities were supposed to be contrasted with the passions. So reason is the sort of rational desire to act in the best way or to do the right thing. And your passions are your impulses, or the things that move you in ways that are not subject to reason. So my preference for strong climate change policies are rational in the sense that I can give you reasons for them. I can tell you why I think this policy is a good policy or that policy is not a good policy. I have reasons for those choices. But my love of vanilla ice cream is not rational. Like I can maybe tell you what I like about it. Vanilla ice cream is creamy in certain ways or whatever. But there's nothing rational about that. When you hear my reasons, that doesn't give you any reason to have my same tastes. So passions are sort of impulses that we have that are not rational. They're not governed by reason, but they're governed by desire. They're governed by compulsion. And right, the idea is that animals are more driven by passions. The passions are the things that overcome you. I'm overcome with the sense of anger. And, maybe if I'm overcome with a sense of anger, I punch the wall. And you might look at me and say, why did you punch the wall? Well, it wasn't a rational action. I didn't really have a reason. I was just overcome with a feeling and emotion, and I acted on that emotion sort of without thinking about it. So the ancient Greek worldview, and again, this is not just Aristotle, this is sort of typical of the of ancient Greek philosophy, is that there's this tension between our rational nature that wants to act on good reasons and our sort of passionate nature, our animal nature. In the Greek tradition, the rational nature is represented by Apollo, the god of the sun, the god of order and reason and logic. And the passions were represented by Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine and festivals, the god of partying, the god of irrationality and chaos and instinct. And so one of the lessons that comes out again and again from ancient Greek philosophy is that reason should rule over passion, that in order to live a good life, you should try to be as rational as possible. You should try to be as Apollo-like as possible. And that the more that we succumb to our passions, the more that we succumb to our instincts and emotions and feelings and compulsions, the worse off our life will be. And so Aristotle and Plato, but also others, the Stoics maybe, argue that passions are things to be skeptical of, to be careful about, and to control, and that the passions should be controlled by reason. You don't have to believe this, of course, and lots of later philosophers argued against this reason or rationality overall sort of perspective. Nietzsche, for instance, argues that the Greek philosophy is not just about reason over passion, but it's really about this, again, harmonic interplay, that there's a sort of balance between reason and passion. So Nietzsche is not arguing that we should party all the time, not arguing that wine and festivals is always the best thing, but maybe sometimes wine and festivals are better than a sort of rational, a sort of purely rational response. Like maybe the purely rational response to political crises is to vote and is to maybe write carefully worded letters to the editor. But maybe the passionate response is to go out into the street and protest. And Nietzsche's not saying that protest is the only thing you should do. Maybe you should also, elect good politicians. But Nietzsche's arguing that maybe there's also a role and an important place for a passion and parties in the good life. Okay, so this is all, again, background and framing for ancient Greek philosophy and the sort of situation that Aristotle is working in. But now I want to talk about Aristotle's. We're about halfway through with this lecture, and for the next half of the lecture, I want to talk about Aristotle's metaphysics, go into his views in more detail, in some very, very high resolution detail, and then talk about some of the problems with Aristotle's metaphysics. All right. I guess to start, though, before we start talking about Aristotle, we should talk about what metaphysics is. This might not be a term you've heard before or used before, or it might be a term you've heard in very limited contexts. So sometimes in popular discussion, metaphysics sort of means like spirituality in general. Like if you go to Barnes & Noble in the metaphysics section, there'll be books on crystals and tarot card readings and chakras and these kinds of things. So in popular discourse, metaphysics sort of means this sort of spiritual dimension to things. But when philosophers are talking about metaphysics, they don't mean really anything about spirituality. Metaphysics is just the study of structure broadly construed. So, in fact, you might think that this is what philosophy is directly. This is one of my favorite descriptions of philosophy, but it works just as well as a description of what metaphysics is. This is from Wilfrid Sellars. So Wilfrid Sellars says that the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. It's to understand how things hang together, but not just particular things, but things in the broadest possible sense. And not just hang together in a particular way, but how do we think about all of the different ways of hanging together? And you might think that this very, very, very general project, what are the things and how do they relate to each other? That this is, at bottom, what metaphysics is about. Not all of philosophy works this way. Maybe ethics, maybe some other more specific philosophical disciplines aren't so concerned with abstraction in this very grandiose sense. But metaphysics is exactly this field of philosophy that's concerned with abstraction. So the metaphysician is interested in what things exist. What does it mean to exist? How do we know that some things exist versus others? So you might be a metaphysician that says that the only things that really exist are the fundamental particles described by physics, quarks and gluons and so on. That those fundamental particles, quarks and electrons, are the real things that exist, and that everything else that exists are just combinations of quarks and electrons and so on. And they need to be combined in certain ways, but if you combine them in certain ways, then you get all the chairs and tables and trees and people built from these quarks. So some people, the sort of radical eliminativists or radical reductionists, would argue that all that really exists are these very simple things, and everything else doesn't really exist. Like, I can say that here's my watch. I can say that my watch exists, but maybe I knock an atom off of the watch. Is it still the same watch? How many atoms can I knock off of the object before it stops being a watch? Right? These are the sort of questions that a metaphysician would ask. You might not think these questions are very interesting. They're very sort of armchair, navel-gazing sort of philosophy questions. Maybe in some sense the kind of questions that make philosophers look bad. But I think there are interesting questions here, and this is just sort of background for understanding what exactly Aristotle's accomplishing by offering his metaphysical framework. So again, this is just supposed to be suggestive for thinking about what it means to be metaphysics. Here's an art piece that I like. This is at the MoMA in New York. The image on the screen here. So this is by Joseph Kosuth, 1 and 3 chairs. So the idea is that there's one chair here. Here's a chair, but there's actually sort of 3 chairs here because there's the chair, and then there's this picture of a chair, a black and white picture of a chair, and then over here is the definition, the dictionary definition of a chair, and then this pronunciation, and then a couple of definitions. The definition here says a seat with a back and often arms, usually for one person, a seat of an office or authority or the office itself, and so on. So in some sense, we only have one chair, but part of the point of the art project here is that, well, these are all different representations of chairs, different manifestations of chairs. I mean, what really makes something a chair? The definition says it's something with a seat and a back and often arms for one person. But this thing doesn't have arms. So the arms must not be a necessary part of the chair. What is necessary for a chair? Well, it says a seat and a back. So this has a seat and a back, but do all chairs have seat and a back? Maybe stools. Stools don't have backs. Is a stool a chair? Or what about a beanbag? Beanbags don't have backs or seats. Is a beanbag a chair? I think they call them beanbag chairs. So what's necessary? Like, what are the necessary parts for being a chair? What makes something a chair or not a chair? Is it any like maybe it's not what parts you have, but just the fact that it's for sitting. So a chair is something to sit on, and a beanbag chair is also something to sit on. So they're both chairs. But I can sit on anything. Like I can sit on a desk. Does that make a desk a chair? Or I can sit on my cat. Does that make my cat a chair? How do we decide what counts as a chair or not? These are metaphysics questions. The idea of calling this metaphysics, so the word physics in Greek is about motion, about what moves. And so physics studies all the things that move. Meta is sort of above or beyond something above or beyond physics. Right? So the idea is that if you're studying physics, you're studying the things that move. If you're studying metaphysics, you're studying what it is to be a thing. And you, in some sense, you have to answer the what it is to be a thing if you want to answer how the things move. In order to ask questions about how things move, you have to understand what a thing is in the first place. And so this is the job of metaphysics. Sometimes they call metaphysics first philosophy because it's sort of the preliminary questions that must be settled in advance. And the idea is that these are the kinds of questions that can't be settled by physics. So physics can tell you how the quarks move, how quarks bind to gluons or whatever. Like quarks can, scientists can tell you about the motion of quarks, how quarks interact with other things, but the physicists can't tell me what atoms need to be in the watch for it to stay the same watch. Like there's the physicists can tell me what happens to the physics if I remove atoms or put different atoms in, but they can't tell me whether it's still a watch or not, because the watch isn't a term in physics. The watch is a term of at a social level, it's a term for an artifact. So physics doesn't get to define what those higher level systems are, and so in some sense, physics is just silent on these sort of higher level questions. So on Aristotle's view, you need to first do metaphysics before you can start doing physics. You need to first understand how things, in the very general sense, hang together, in the very general sense. Another reference for what is metaphysics is the ship of Theseus problem. Some of you might have run into the ship of Theseus before. It works the same sort of way as these other examples, what counts as a chair. So, but just in case you want to talk about it in chat or whatever, the ship of Theseus. So Theseus is a king in the ancient world, and he has this ship that he loves. He just adores the ship. He wants nothing ever bad to happen with the ship. He takes care of it. He spares no expense in taking care of it. He tells the person taking care of the ship, anytime any part of the ship goes bad, a plank of wood rots, a door handle tarnishes, replace it immediately. I'd never let any part go bad on this ship. Make sure the ship is always in tip-top shape whenever I want it. So this happens for a while. The King Theseus, pours a bunch of money into this ship, and it stays in tip-top shape for a long time. But after some time has passed, Theseus realizes that, in fact, every piece on his ship has been replaced. Every part of his original ship has worn down or tarnished to some minimal extent that was enough to get that part replaced. And that Theseus is looking at his ship now, say 10 years later, 10 years after he first makes his ship, and he realizes that no part in the ship, every single plank of wood, every rope and every doorknob has been replaced and removed from its original piece and replaced with a new piece. And so the ship in front of him now is entirely constituted by new pieces that weren't in the ship 10 years ago when he first had it built. And then Theseus has a crisis. Is this still my ship? Or have I lost my ship through this replacement effort? Right, so which ship is Theseus' ship? Is it the original ship that first started out? Does it stay his ship even after he's changing out the parts? Let me add a wrinkle to this. Imagine that I am Theseus' biographer. Like I'm writing a biography of him. I'm collecting all of his personal affects for a museum that I'm creating in Theseus' honor. And so I have his toothbrush, and I have a comb that he used, and I have his booty socks from when he was an infant, and I've got all this stuff. And then I start seeing that he's throwing out pieces of his ship, and the pieces aren't really that bad. In fact, they're barely worn at all. And Theseus is just very picky about his ship. And so, unbeknownst to Theseus, I spend my time in the dumpster, and every time he throws out one of the parts of his ship, I take that part and I put it in my museum. And after 10 years go by and Theseus has replaced every part in his ship, I've now accumulated all those spare parts and constructed an exact duplicate of Theseus' ship in my museum. So now there's two ships. There's Theseus' ship in his dock made of all new parts, and there's my ship in the museum that's made of all of the original parts of Theseus' ship from 10 years ago. In fact, the ship in my museum is an exact replica. It's not just an exact replica. It's the exact same ship as Theseus' earlier ship 10 years ago. All of the parts in Theseus' original ship are now in my museum. And Theseus, the ship that Theseus thinks is his, that's in the harbor, is made of entirely new parts. So which ship is Theseus's? Is it mine in the museum, or is it the one in the harbor? Maybe Theseus gets mad and comes into my museum and says, "No, you must give me that ship. That ship's my ship. You have no right to take my ship." Can Theseus take that ship? I mean, I guess he's king, so he can do whatever he wants. But part of the point is that this is a matter for us to decide at a high level. Like, is this something that we're going to consider as Theseus' ship, or is this something that we're going to not consider as Theseus' ship? Maybe both of them are his ships. Maybe he has two ships now. Part of what I want to say is that these kinds of questions are not settled by the physics. Like, just knowing the material components of the ship doesn't tell you which ship is Theseus's. It doesn't tell you whether the ship stays the same ship over time. That these more abstract metaphysical questions are not settled by the physics, but you have to go to some other philosophical resource to settle them. Maybe you have to go to a theory of ownership, or a theory of what it means to be the same ship over time as things change. In fact, this is one of the key topics for metaphysicians, is to explain how change happens at all. That things change over time and things never sort of stay the same. My ship, the pieces eventually wear down. Things are always changing. And how do we account for that change? How do we recognize that something is identical to itself across these changes? Some of the Greek philosophers thought that change is what defined and ruled the cosmos, and because of change, you could never have a stable metaphysics. Heraclitus says, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man. The idea is that the river is constantly changing, and the person is also constantly changing. And so you can never have the same event repeated twice, because things are changing so much that it's never the same event. This is a kind of radically skeptical metaphysics, where there are no persistent objects over time, that everything is constituted by change. Aristotle's metaphysics is not like Heraclitus. Heraclitus thinks that nothing is stable, but what Aristotle wants is a stable theory that explains why things are the way they are, and explains how things can stay the same thing even across changes. And maybe this is most obvious in something like a human being. So I like to think that I'm the same person that I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I'm still Daniel Estrada. I use the same name. All my friends and family know me as the same person. It seems like maybe I'm the same person over time, but at the same time, almost everything about me has changed. My behavior patterns, the kinds of things I do, where I live, all this stuff has changed. Moreover, almost everything in my body has changed. Every single atom and cell in my body has died and regenerated over those 10 years. The sort of folk statistic of this is that every 7 years you regenerate just about every cell in your body, which means every 7 years you're an entirely new person, potentially. So how do we account for the persistence of identity over time, or the lack of persistence of identity over time? How do we account for the way that some things change into other things over time? If you put milk out in the sun, it eventually curdles and turns into cheese. How do you explain this change in the kind of thing that it is? Again, there's lots of views for this kind of stuff, and to some extent, the ancient elemental views that we've already been considering are ways of accounting for change, metaphysical change. But Aristotle has this very unique view within this sort of ancient framework. So let's start getting into some of the details. So the first dimension of Aristotle's views that I want to talk about is his view of causation. He's got a more elaborate view of causation than we would recognize. In some ways, it's more elaborate than what we would recognize in the modern world. In modern physics, there's basically sort of one sense of causation. That something causes another. The really important thing for physicists today is that causal relationship sets an order of events, or sort of an ordered sequence of events, so that one event happens after another. And the laws of physics, or the equations that physicists use to explain the development of systems, is supposed to explain how this sequence of events happens over time. So why a system in this configuration eventually leads to a system in this other configuration. The laws of physics are supposed to explain the trajectory from one state to another, and it's really just the sort of sequential ordering of these states of the system, and it's that ordering that modern science is going to think about in terms of cause and effect. But Aristotle doesn't just have a single causal theory. He's actually got a view where there are different kinds of causes, and you need to account for all of these kinds of causes in order to explain anything. So the four causes here you see on the slide, there's the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. So there's when I say cause, maybe the word cause is a little bit ambiguous or a little bit difficult to process. Maybe better to say explanation, that if we want to explain something, we need to talk about four different kinds of explanation that are all relevant to explaining the thing. So there's the material explanation, the formal explanation, and then the efficient final explanation. So the material explanation is what it's made of, the material that it's made of. So if we're talking about this table here, if the table is made of wood, then the material cause is the wood that it's made of. The thing is that wood can take lots of shapes. Wood is sort of a blank resource in which you can build lots of different kinds of tables. You can build a bed, or you can build a chair. The wood itself doesn't tell you what you eventually build it into. So the raw material, you might also think of the raw material as sort of a shapeless material. I mean, obviously these boards and planks have particular dimension, 2x2s or whatever, 2x4s. But that formal shape of the material doesn't have a lot of constraint over what the final object is going to be. So this table, you can make a table of any shape with any pieces of wood if you build it right, if you know what you're doing. So think of the material as the sort of raw, unformed material, the raw material from which the thing is built. And then the form is the shape that it takes. So if we're building this table, well, the table has 3 legs, and the legs are shaped like this, and the top of the table has this particular shape. This is basically geometry. So you can think of the of the formal cause. The formal cause is the geometric qualities, or maybe the blueprint for the table, the outline, the shape of the table. And then what it is to build a table is to take the raw materials and to put it in that shape. Right? If I can take the raw materials and to put it in the shape of a table, then I built a table. So that's pretty easy to understand. You take some material, you put it in a form, and then you get a thing. So the material and formal cause build the thing. But there's 2 other causes that are really important for Aristotle. And this is maybe what makes Aristotle's view very different from modern scientific views. So one thing that Aristotle is going to say that causes or explains the table is what he calls the efficient cause. And the efficient cause is the process that brings it about. So we already know that you need to take wood and you need to put it in the shape. But how do you do that? Like, what are the steps? If you're a carpenter, what are the steps that you're taking to take that wood and bend it into that shape? And the carpenter is going to have a bunch of skills and background knowledge and a bunch of techniques for shaping the wood as they want it. Right? This is what the craft of woodworking is about taking the wood and molding it to your design. So the efficient cause is what explains that process, how you took the material and turned it into that final design. Notice that the final design is this sort of abstract geometric shape. And so you're not messing with the abstract geometric shape. What you're really doing is you're messing with the material to bring it into that shape. And so that process, or the steps you need to take in order to turn the raw wood into a finished table, that's the efficient cause. Okay, so far so good, and I think so far most modern scientists are going to be perfectly happy with this discussion. Yes, there's stuff. Yes, there's also geometry, and you can put stuff into geometric terms by using certain engineering techniques. Any of my engineering students would be perfectly fine with this, and I think so far everything that I've said is more or less compatible with what modern science believes. But Aristotle's not done yet. What's left out here is, for Aristotle, the most important of the causes, most important of the explanations, and that's what the thing is for. So even if you know everything about the material, even if you know everything about the formal geometric properties, the shape, and even if you know everything about how it was built, what process brought it about, you still don't know what it's for. You still don't know the purpose. This is the final cause. For Aristotle, the word here is telos. So telos just means the purpose or the end or the goal or what it's for. Right, so a table is for, in this image, it says the table is for dining. Or you eat on a table, you dine on the table, I guess. You set things on the table for easy retrieval. And knowing that this is what the table is for is partly what informs the design of the table. Like if the table is for setting things on, then it would be really bad for the table to have a lopsided top. Right? If the top were slanted at a steep angle, then you couldn't put anything on it without it falling off. And that would be a very bad design for a table. And you can tell that's a bad design for the table because you know what the table's for. It's not just about knowing the material and the process of building it. It's not just about knowing the material and the process of building it. It's about knowing the end goal for that table. Once you know what the table's for, you can make informed decisions about what the design should be and what process you should be using to build it, and what materials you should make it out of. Like if you know that this is going to be a table for dining, then you probably don't want to make it out of radioactive material. Why? Well, because you don't want to give radiation poisoning to everyone who eats at this table. Right? And so knowing what it's for informs all of the other causes. And in fact, this is partly what the carpenter does in using his technical skills to build the wood, is that the carpenter is using his knowledge of what the table is for in order to inform the use and working of the material into that final design. So the carpenter selects the design and selects the material by being informed of what the thing is for. So for Aristotle to explain anything, you need to appeal to all four of these causes, and in particular, you need to understand the purpose of the thing. And that's all well and good when we're talking about artifacts, like pieces of technology, like tables, because tables are built for a particular purpose. There's some skilled artisan who designed that table for that purpose. But Aristotle thinks that this doesn't just apply to artifacts, but this applies to all things, so that everything has a purpose. Everything has a goal, a telos, an end. And the purpose of the thing is to achieve that end, is to achieve that purpose, is to achieve that goal. So not just artifacts like tables or hammers or chairs, but also living things like a tree or a human being. You have a purpose on Aristotle's view. You have an end goal. There's something that you are for. Well, what are you for? Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Aristotle's metaphysics. So I've talked about the four causes, but this is just a little piece of Aristotle's metaphysics. There's a background idea working here, which is this idea of hylomorphism. So for Aristotle, anything is a substance. So a rock is a substance, a chair, a table is a substance, but also an organism, a cat or a tree or a person. They're all substances. And every substance for Aristotle is a combination of matter and form. So we saw a little bit of this in the causal theory. But on Aristotle's view, form and matter don't exist on their own. There's no pure form and there's no pure matter. Instead, every substance that exists is some combination of form and matter. Another way of saying form and matter, so another way of saying matter is to talk about potential. And Aristotle's idea here is that the raw material is potentially something like the raw wood is potentially a table. It's also potentially a door. It's potentially a bed. So there's like a lot of potential in this raw wood. And the idea is that this potential is actualized when you shape it into that final form. When you inform the stuff, you make a substance. Right? So the hylomorphism, hyle is the Greek word for stuff, like junk, like a pile of stuff. And morph is the form. And so hylomorphism is the view that substances are the realization of form in matter. So, for instance, I'm in a building, in an apartment building. The apartment building is made of concrete and wood and steel and bricks. So that's all the raw stuff. We can imagine this building all of the stuff that went into the building, all the screws and all the wood planks and so on. You can imagine all that stuff piled in a field, maybe in pallets, sort of like at a Home Depot. Like there's just pallets of raw materials all stacked up, a bunch of wood and so on. So that's the raw material that built this building. And that raw material sitting in the field, it's potentially this building, but it's not yet the building because it hasn't taken the form of the building. Right? And so to build the building, you need to take that raw material and put it in the right way in order to create the structure. And what is that right way? Well, it's the form of the building. And so for a building like this, you'll have a set of blueprints that mark out where all the rooms are and where all the buildings are and where all the support beams are, and HVAC and how the electrical system runs through the building. All of that stuff is written on a blueprint that gives you the sort of guide for building the building, for constructing the building. So you can think of the blueprint as the form, and you can think of the raw materials as the stuff, the hele, and you can think of the finished building, the building that I'm standing in right now, or sitting in right now, that's the substance. The substance isn't just the raw material, and it's not just the form, but it's when when the material is put into the form, that it becomes a substance. So things are substances. You never have raw form or raw material by themselves. Even, and I said this earlier, but even the raw wood here is still in some form or other. It's still in these wood planks, 2x2s. So that's a kind of form. You never have material by itself that's sort of formless, and you never have form by itself. I was talking about the blueprints earlier, but obviously those blueprints are not pure form. They're on a sheet of paper that I printed out, and I can fold it up and so on. I can rip the paper. Right. So there's a material aspect to those blueprints also. So on Aristotle's view, form and matter never come apart. And matter is potentially something, and when that something is built, that something is actualized. Again, these ancient views, I think, are still pretty deeply embedded in the modern discourse. So you sometimes hear people, especially like self-help people, sort of self-help or sort of confidence-building routines, where people talk about realizing your maximum potential or self-actualizing. Self-actualizing is just realizing your maximum potential. Right? This idea is that you have some sort of great thing that you could be, and the goal is to realize that potential that's sort of in you to bring out. This is fundamentally an Aristotelian idea. This is an idea that's thousands of years old that Aristotle talked about in some detail. Okay, so so knowing your potential, knowing what the actualized form of you is, this is the telos. This is your goal. And Aristotle's idea is that everything has this kind of goal. Everything has some ideal state that it's sort of yearning to achieve, or that's aimed for. So of the substances, Aristotle divides the substances into three basic kinds. What he calls the inanimate, the animate, and the eternal. The inanimate objects are objects that move entirely through natural motion. And here natural motion relates back to the kinds of material. So I actually need to go back a few slides here, way back to our Greek humorist view. Aristotle believes that the basic elements were earth, air, fire, and water. And not only were these the basic elements, but the elements had a natural ordering, so that earth was the heaviest, and earth goes down to the bottom. So if you have a bunch of elements together, earth has the natural motion of seeking the bottom of things. And water sits above earth. So if you have a bunch of stuff, the earthen things will sink to the bottom, and the watery things, the things made mostly of water, will sit on top of the earthen things. The things that are made mostly of air will sit on top of the things made of water, and then the things made of fire are at the very top. The things that made of fire are the things that go up. So this is supposed to explain motion and of the inanimate objects. So let me see here. I have things. Here's a pen. Here's a Sharpie pen. It's made of, let's say, earthen things. Let's say it's mostly made of earthen things. It has some weight to it. It's not very heavy, so it's not a whole lot of earth. Maybe there's a lot of air in it too. But those things, the combination of material in this causes the kind of physical reaction you see here, that when I let go of the pen, it falls down, it drops. And the reason that it drops is because the pen is mostly made of earth, and earthen things want to go down. So the motion of the pen follows its natural motion to the bottom. But if I instead have things made of fire, so here's a lighter, and if I light the lighter, you see the fire, and you see the flame on the fire goes up. And flames go up because fire has its natural resting place at the highest part. And so we can explain on this view why things go up or down. This is the so-called natural motion. And inanimate things on Aristotle's view, the inanimate things on Aristotle's view are things that move sort of purely by this natural motion. So it moves according to its material constitution. If it's made of earthen things, it goes down. If it's made of fire, it goes up. And the inanimate things will sort of settle in their natural place. But not everything is inanimate on Aristotle's view. There's also the animate creatures. Animate here is the Latin word for soul, animal. Soul means, the Latin word here is anima, which is the Latin word for soul. So the animate creatures are the creatures with soul, the creatures with a soul. And on Aristotle's view, the soul is what makes the animate creatures move differently from the inanimate creatures. So again, these are different kinds of substances. The world is mostly made of these inanimate creatures that move only according to their natural physics. But the world is also made of these animate creatures, and the animate creatures move in a different way. They're different because of different motion. And what Aristotle says is that the animate creatures move according to an internal principle. That there's internal drives in animate creatures that move them in ways unlike the inanimate creatures. So if I put my pen on the desk and then move away and don't touch it, that pen will stay there for all of time. Maybe something else can move it, right? So if no one else touches it, still a gust of wind or something can move it, or a tree branch might swipe at the pen and move it to the side. So the thing can still move, but all that movement comes from the outside. It comes from either its natural principle or other things moving it from the outside. The pen never moves of its own accord. The pen only moves to its natural resting place. This is Aristotle's idea. But living things do move of their own accord. That's what it means to have a soul. That's what makes them animate. So anima is where we get the word animal. It's also where we get the word animation. What makes something animate is that it has this unique kind of motion, and the motion is there to satisfy internal drives. So we're starting to see Aristotle's sort of metaphysics sort of blossom out, and we're going to spend more time here talking about the animate creatures. So animate creatures, on Aristotle's view, are a kind of substance, a kind of combination of form and matter, and they have potential, but the potential really depends on the kind of thing it is. And for Aristotle, there are three different kinds of animate creatures. All of these creatures on Aristotle's view have a soul. They're all creatures with the soul. They're all creatures that are, when Aristotle says a soul, what he means is that they're alive, that they're living creatures, and living creatures move unlike the inanimate creatures. So they're alive, but there's three different sort of tiers of being alive. There's three different kinds of souls, and the simplest soul is what Aristotle calls the nutritive soul. It's the soul that plants have. So Aristotle recognizes that plants are alive, and they do the basic processes of living things. They take in nutrition, they grow, and they reproduce, and they die. And this process of taking in nutrition, growth, reproduction, death, is common to all things with souls. So non-living things, the inanimate things, they don't grow, they don't use nutrition, they don't die. A rock just sits there, a pen just sits there. Maybe the pen runs out of ink, but that's not the same thing as the inanimate creature dying. But plants live and die in the relevant sense, and so they have a soul in the relevant sense also. And that means that plants are going to be doing things that are not just driven by their elemental natural motion, but they're really driven by the principle, by the formal principle of that kind of creature. Say it another way, there's an idealized, fully realized version of every plant, and what plants try to do through their nutritive development is to try to achieve that ideal form. Not every plant does. Some of the plants, especially the ones that are in my care, tend to die off because I don't water them properly or whatever. So not every plant lives to achieve its ideal, but the idea is that it has a soul and it's driven to some idealized final form. And it's this move to the idealized final form that explains why a tree starts out as an acorn, and that acorn eventually sprouts into a full tree. And so it changes over time, and that change is explained in part by reference to its final state, its final cause. So the trees have the nutritive soul as the simplest kind of soul. This is all discussed in De Anima, the Aristotle reading, De Anima. Trees have the simplest kind of soul. The proper animals, like cats and dogs, and cows and horses, and so on. These are animals. They're sort of the true sense of animals. They're not merely nutritive. They don't merely sort of take in nutrition and grow and die. But they're also importantly sensitive. That what makes an animal is that it has sensations. And for Aristotle, the most important sensation is pain and pleasure. That animals can sense pain, they can sense pleasure, and the way that they act is in response to pain and pleasure. So if something is hurting them, then they move away or they do something to change whatever's hurting them. And if something's pleasurable, then they'll keep doing it. Again, if I put my pen on the desk and I walk away, it's going to sit there for all of time. The pen doesn't have any self-interest. It's not doing anything to control its own behavior. But if I put my cat on the desk and then I walk away, cat might sit there for a minute, might take a nap, but eventually the cat's going to get hungry. Hunger is a kind of pain, and that hunger is going to move the cat to go find food. Right? So the idea is that the cat is not driven simply by this natural motion of physics, but is also driven by these internal drives that animate its soul, like hunger, like reproductive drives. And it's this sensation that explains the unique kind of motion of animals, in particular that they have locomotion, that they can move themselves around to satisfy their ends. So all animals also have a nutritive part. Animals also need to take in nutrition. They grow, reproduce, and die. But animals also have this capacity for sensation, and this sensation allows them to do more things than just plants can do. In particular, they can locomote, they can move around because they feel pain and pleasure. On Aristotle's view, plants are not sensitive. They're nutritive. They need nutrients going in. They need water and sunlight and so on. So plants are nutritive. They grow. Their growth depends on the environment interacting with them in the right sort of way. But they're not sensitive in the sense that they don't feel pain and pleasure. Like maybe they're reactive to their environments, but not to the extent that they feel pain and pleasure. Because if they did feel pain and pleasure on Aristotle's view, then they would move around to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, exactly the way that animals do. Right? So it's because animals feel pain and pleasure that explains why they move the way they do. Plants don't move that same way, so they don't feel pain and pleasure. And finally, the highest version of the soul, the highest kind of soul, is the rational soul. The rational soul is something that Aristotle thinks is unique to humans. Like most of the Greek philosophers, he thinks that this is a sort of addition or add-on. It's an expansion pack to the animal soul. So Aristotle thinks that humans are animals. We're among the animals, and what that means is that we have both a nutritive and a sensitive soul. So humans have a plant soul. We're nutritive. We need nutrition. We grow and we reproduce and we die. Animals have the nutritive soul. We also have the sensitive soul. We also feel pain and pleasure. We're sensitive to our environment in ways that get us to move around. And so we're also animals. But we're the particular kind of animal that's also sensitive to reasons. We're rational. Right? So you can give me reasons to do things, and maybe those are things that I'm not sensing right away. Like, for instance, investing in my 401k, in my retirement plan. I have a retirement plan. The retirement plan is supposed to, or Social Security. Everyone who pays into Social Security, everyone with a job, is supposed to, in theory, get money back when they retire at 65 or 67 or whatever. That's a long time away. I don't know what it's going to be like when I'm 67. I don't know what kind of money I need, and I'm certainly not feeling any of the benefits of that retirement package right now. If I do experience any of those benefits, and to be quite honest, that's still a big if, but if I do experience any of those benefits, it won't be for a very long time from now. Nevertheless, even though this is not something in my immediate experience, even though it has nothing to do with my immediate pain and pleasure, in fact, if anything, it's giving me more pain than pleasure, because it's these retirement accounts are taking money out of my paycheck. So I get less money because I'm investing in these retirement accounts. But even though it's slightly painful, from a sensitive perspective. Like I can feel the crunch on my wallet. I know from a rational perspective that this is going to help me out a lot in the future. That 30 years from now, when I retire, I'm going to be really happy that I paid into my retirement fund, and then I'm going to experience a lot of benefits at that point. Now, I'm not experiencing those benefits now, so if I'm only acting on my immediate sensation, it would seem silly to do it. You can't tell the difference. But in 30 years, I will be able to tell the difference. And because I'm rational, I can make that kind of delayed gratification action. I can act not in my immediate interests, but in my interests down the road. And this is the kind of thing that Aristotle does not think that the other animals can do. Aristotle will think the animals are sensitive, they feel pain and pleasure, but they can't think about their long-term well-being and plan for the future in the same sort of way as we can. You're all college students. You know that going to classes, watching these lectures on philosophy, this is not the most pleasurable thing you could be doing. If you were just seeking out your maximum pleasure, there's a whole range of other things that are far more pleasurable than listening to these philosophy lectures. But you also know that you're getting a degree, getting a good grade in this class, and graduating on time and so on is important to your long-term well-being. And so you're willing to sacrifice some things now for these greater rewards later on. And that's not merely a sensitive kind of action. That's a rational kind of action. It's not just that you're acting on your immediate sensations. You're acting in sort of your long-term understanding of what's in your interest. And again, this is not the kind of thing that my cat or my dog can do. Like my cat, when my cat is hungry, my cat goes to eat. And when it stops being hungry, it stops eating. My cat really doesn't do anything to plan for its future. My cat doesn't think about its retirement, doesn't think about what kind of cat it wants to be in the future. My cat has no ambitions beyond what it's doing in the moment. And so in this sense, the cat is not rational. It's not acting on the basis of reason. It's just acting on the basis of sensation, sort of its immediate gratification. Now, a couple of caveats here. One thing is that humans obviously can act on their immediate sensations. Maybe some humans only do what's immediately pleasurable and don't really think too hard about their long-term benefit or well-being. In which case, Aristotle will just say, well, those people are acting like animals. They're sort of indulging their animal nature, and they're not really thinking about what they're doing. And I mean, that's fine. You can live like an animal, but you're missing out on really the kind of thing you are. You've misunderstood your purpose. You've misunderstood the kind of thing you are. And you're not just an animal. You're the special kind of animal that uses reason. And if you don't make use of your reason, you're somehow sort of avoiding your purpose or your goals. My cat doesn't have an option to use reason, and so there's nothing wrong with the cat just acting on its desires. But human beings can. Human beings, at least Aristotle thinks, have this capacity to control our passions with reason. And this is what makes us different from the animals, even though we are also an animal. But we also have this rational soul that needs to be accounted for. So I just ran through this really dense slide pretty quickly. One thing I haven't talked about is the eternal objects. This is a different kind of substance. Remember, Aristotle thinks that there's the inanimate objects, there's the animate objects, and then there's these eternal objects. For Aristotle, the eternal objects are things like the stars and the sun and the moon. For Aristotle, these objects don't move by some natural principle because they're not arranged in the elemental hierarchy. So it's not like there's some natural place where they're going to rest. So instead of going to find their resting place, the celestial objects for Aristotle, they move in eternal patterns. So the idea is that the sun always moves in this continuous arc across the sky, and it's done that forever and will continue doing that forever. And similarly with the moon moves in this continual pattern around the sky. It's a perfect circle in orbit around the Earth. And this perfect motion is, it's not stable, right? So the moon doesn't just stay still, the moon moves, but it moves in an eternal pattern. So the pattern is stable. This is not the case with any of the animate creatures, right? For animate creatures, they all live and die. They change quite dramatically over the course of their lives. And so there's not that same kind of eternal stability for the animals. While we're here talking about eternal stability, Aristotle doesn't believe in an eternal soul. In fact, he doesn't believe in any kind of soul that survives the death of the body. Remember, Aristotle believes that stuff and matter, matter and form come together into substances. And so you are a living substance, and part of the character of your living substance is having a particular form, having a particular a shape to your processes. And when you die, that shape is gone. That shape is just no longer there. So Aristotle doesn't believe there's any kind of soul that survives the body, or lives on in the afterlife. There's no internal thing inside you that's your soul, like a ghost inside you, that lives on after you die. For Aristotle, you are your body, but your body as this kind of active living process where you're making decisions and sensing your environment and so on. And what it is to be alive, what it is to be a living human, is to undergo these processes. And when you die, those processes cease and you no longer exist. So a lot of this discussion about Aristotle and the soul, you should not be thinking about soul in the sense of a religious view. Aristotle is really just talking about what it means to be a living system, and living systems have these basic breakdown. So hopefully you're starting to see the architectonic metaphysics of Aristotle's system coming together, right? We can explain what human beings should do with their lives, like how they should make their decisions, by understanding this much more general metaphysical structure of the relationship between stuff and form, right? How substances are formed, the causal structure of the universe. This is what I mean by architectonic metaphysics. So let me talk a little bit more about souls. So for Aristotle, humans are a different kind of thing than cats, and a different kind of thing still from plants. Humans have a nutritive soul just like plants, and have a sensitive soul just like animals. But the essence of what it is to be human, the form of human, the substance of human, is sort of unique to humans, and it's just different from what it is to be a cat, and different still from what it is to be a plant, and different still from what it is to be an inanimate or an eternal object. Right? These are all different kinds. These are all fundamentally different substances or essences. So the word essence comes to us from the Greek totiesti. Totiesti is just what it is. So when we're talking about the essence of a human or the essence of a cat, we're talking about what it is to be a human or what it is to be a cat. The essence, again, is not the ghost of the thing. It's not some sort of spirit inhabiting the thing. The essence is the metaphysical nature of the thing, what it is to be that kind of thing. So what it is to be a rational person is to have these capacities for acting on reasons. This is the essence of humanity, is to be rational. Aristotle says we're the political animal. We're a rational animal, but we're also a political animal. So part of the essence of being a human is to not just think rationally, but to engage in political society on a rational basis. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about Aristotle. I want to actually read a little passage from Aristotle. And this is from De Anima. This is where he's explaining the nature of the soul and these different parts of the soul. And here is this passage where he explains what the soul is. So this is ancient Greek philosophy. It's a little bit difficult, so go through it slowly, reread things a couple of times. Let's try this. So Aristotle says on the soul, he says, it's been stated in general what the soul is, for it is a substance corresponding to the principle of a thing. And this is what it is for it to be what it was, for a body of such a kind. He says, compare the following. If an instrument, for example, an axe, were a natural body, then its substance would be what it is to be an axe, and this would be its soul. And if this were removed, it would no longer be an axe, except homonymously. He's saying if something like an axe, like a thing that you're chopping wood with, if the axe were a natural body, obviously axes are artificial, they're artifacts, they're things that humans built. But Aristotle is saying, if the axe were a natural body, if nature built axes, then the substance of an axe, the essence of an axe, the principle of the axe, would be what it is to be an axe, he says, and this would be its soul. So the soul of the axe is what it is to be an axe. And what is it to be an axe? Well, an axe is for chopping. Axes chop wood. So what Aristotle is saying is that the substance of an axe, the soul of an axe, is its chopping. What it is to be an axe is to chop. The soul of the axe is its chopping. So if this were to be removed from the axe, it would no longer be an axe except homonymously. Homonymously here means like by the same name. Like if something wasn't for chopping, but maybe it looked like an axe, maybe we'd still call it an axe. But it's only the word we're using for it. It's not really an axe. Let me actually go back to this picture. Oops, this picture. This is a chair. We might think that chairs are for sitting. And so what it is to be a chair is the substance of a chair, the essence of a chair is to be a thing for sitting. But notice that this chair is not for sitting because this isn't a museum. This is a museum piece. There's probably a sign near this that says do not sit in the chair. And there's probably like a guard nearby that anytime anyone sits in the chair, they shoo them off. So we call this a chair because it looks like a chair. It's the kind of thing that would be a chair, except this is not in fact a chair, but homonymously, like we call it a chair. But it's not really a chair because it's not for sitting. It's not the thing that you should be sitting in because it's an art piece. So if the axe were a natural body, then the substance would be what it is to be an axe, and this would be its soul. Aristotle goes on in the next passage. He says, we must consider what has been said in relation to the parts of the body also. For if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul. For this is the eye's substance corresponding to its principle. The eye is matter for sight, and if this fails, it is no longer an eye, except homonymously, just like an eye in stone or a painted eye. So again, just like the soul of the axe is what it is to be an axe. Axes are for chopping. The soul of the axe is for chopping. The axe is for chopping. The soul of the axe just is the chopping. In the same way that the eye is for seeing. So Aristotle says if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul. Sight is not a special ghost inside the animal. Sight is, or inside the eye. Sight is what the eye does. Sight is the function that the eye performs. So for Aristotle, the soul is the function. That the soul of the eye, if the eye were a natural body considered by itself, if the eye were an animal, sight would be its soul. Sight is the function of the eye. The soul is the function of the animal. The soul is what it's for, and what it's for is what its essence is. He says, the eye is matter for sight, and if this fails, it's no longer an eye except homonymously, just like the eye in stone or a painted eye. So if I go to a statue, the statue has a face, and there's an eye in the statue, but that eye can't see. I might call it an eye, if I say that, look at his eyes, but they're not really eyes because they don't see, because they lack the soul of an eye. And again, it's not because there's some ghost in my eye that makes my eye for seeing, and there's no soul, there's no ghost inside the statue. What's really going on is that my eye is part of a natural body. It's part of an organism. And this is what Aristotle is really getting at here, is that, I'm in the way again. Let me move myself over a second. Here we go. So this is what Aristotle is really getting at, is that the soul or the principle of a thing is really its function. This is what the point of the teleology, the point of the telos is that the telos tells us the purpose or the function of a thing. And what Aristotle understands maybe more vividly than most of the thinkers at his time was that animals are composed of, literally constituted by, different functional parts that are each playing different functional roles. I think I didn't put this... I didn't put the big payoff here. Aristotle says that what is important about organisms, what's important about understanding the soul of an organism, is to understand that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That the whole organism has the nature that it does because of its component parts, because of its organs, and each of the organs themselves have a function. So we're organized systems, and what it is to be an organized system is to have lots of functionally differentiated parts that are all working together to allow for what the whole is doing. So one of my parts is my eye, and my eye is responsible for seeing, and another part is my ear, and my ear is responsible for hearing, and so on. I have lots of these functional parts, and they're all assembled and hooked into each other in the right sort of way, that the end result of the whole organism is the end result is a whole organism, where the organism has properties that none of the individual parts have, right? So I'm a rational agent. None of my individual parts are rational, but what allows me to be rational is how all of those parts are hooked together, right? So this is the problem of organization. Organizations are composed of different organs playing different functional roles. These organs are all hooked in together in this sort of hierarchical fashion, and this organizational structure characterizes not just biology, but really the entire system of metaphysics. It characterizes the logic and the physics and the sort of systematic hierarchical arrangement of all the different things. So Aristotle thinks that everything has a purpose, everything has a sort of natural function, including human beings. The function of a human being is to be rational, is to be as rational as we can be, is to make good choices as a rational agent living amongst other people. It's important that our function is to act rationally and not merely act on our animal nature. So if people acted sort of purely animalistically, just on their basic desires, then you'd get people who are sort of corrupt and bad on Aristotle's view, corrupted and bad and unsuccessful in all sorts of ways. If you wanted to lead a successful life, a happy life, then you should follow our natural, our essence, and our essence is to be rational. The happy human life is one that is lived rationally, on Aristotle's view. This is not a trivial issue, this idea of sort of solving the organization of systems. The idea that there are functionally differentiated organs in a complex organism. The word organ, just to point out, the word organ is like your lungs, your liver, or heart. Same root as the word organism, organization, like a business organization. And this word comes from the Indo-European word erg, which is Northern European languages turned into the word work. This is basically what an organ is. Organs do work for the organism, for the overarching system. An organ is a piece of a larger system that performs some specialized role. So Aristotle understands this to some extent, the sort of basic framework of organization. What Aristotle doesn't really understand, and we have to wait another 1,000 years of science and philosophy to really get at, is self-organization. Aristotle doesn't understand how organisms can come to have their organizational structure simply on the basis of their own operation. To some extent, Aristotle thinks that the essences that exist have always existed. Like, there's always been human beings, and this is the sort of natural archetype of the human being. And there's the good for humanity has been the good for humanity for all of time. And there's a certain kind of thing that a cat is, and there's something that's good for a cat. There's the idealized form of the cat that all cats are trying to achieve. And that's sort of unique to cats, and there's a different one for dogs, and there's a different one for zebras, and so on. And all of these essential characters sort of have existed for all time, and we're just playing out different instances of these general types. Aristotle has no idea of evolution, so Aristotle doesn't understand that, for instance, cats and dogs might be different now, but they were basically the same creature 50,000 years ago when they had a common ancestor. And in fact, all of the speciation that we see, all the different kinds of creatures that we see, have common ancestors back to the very first creatures 3.5 billion years ago. Aristotle doesn't really understand how evolution drives the self-organization of systems. Aristotle is really just assuming that there are these different kinds of creatures, and they operate in different ways. And if you understand how these different kinds relate to each other and what's good for the different kinds, then you understand how the world works. Important to Aristotle's view is this teleology, is that there's some purpose or goal for all of the functions and for all of the substances, not just the artifacts, but the natural systems as well. Again, the image, the popular example of this is the acorn to the oak tree. An acorn is this sort of simple initial state. It's the unrealized potential. But if everything goes well for that acorn, if it's watered and given enough sunlight over long enough time, then it'll eventually grow into a mighty oak tree. And that oak tree is the sort of idealized final form of that acorn. It's what the acorn is aimed at. It's the telos for the acorn. And so you can think of that final state sort of like a bullseye. If we're doing like archery, you want to hit the bullseye. That's what you're aiming for. But there's lots of things that can throw you off of the bullseye. If there's a gust of wind, might throw the arrow off, or if you're not exactly steady with your aim, if you're not well practiced, and so on. There's lots of things that can throw you off from your bullseye. And same thing for the acorn. Like not every acorn grows into a mighty oak tree. Lots of it, in fact, most acorns don't. If every acorn grew into an oak tree, we'd be overrun with oak trees. But instead, most acorns fail. Most acorns are stepped on or squished or buried or eaten by squirrels, and none of those acorns get to survive into the finalized oak tree. Right? So you can think of all of those failed acorns as things that fall off the bullseye in various directions. But Aristotle's idea is that every creature, every kind of creature, has a bullseye that they're aiming for, has something they're trying to hit, has a purpose, and whether they hit that bullseye or not is it depends on how things go. But that's the goal. That there is that goal, and that's what we want. For Aristotle, the general goal that he wants to talk about is the good life. For living creatures, is the good life, sometimes called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is eu is the Greek prefix for good, and daimon is spirit. So the good life is good spirit. You think of it as like doing well. Philosophers like to use the word flourishing. So think of like a garden. If I'm growing a garden, there's a clear distinction between a flourishing, healthy, productive garden and a wilting or dying garden. Maybe a garden that's not very healthy can be brought back to life, but there's a sort of clear distinction between whether the garden is doing well or whether it's failing, and it has to do with things like are the flowers blooming, is it producing fruit, and so on. And it's that flourishing garden that all of these plants aim for, but not all of them actually achieve. In order to build that flourishing garden, you have to be tending to the garden in the right sort of way. And so this is what life is about. This is really what ethics is about making sure that we're tending to our lives and each other in ways that help us realize or fully actualize these ideal ends. The good life. We all want the good life. We're not all able to achieve it, but we're all aimed in that direction. And there's things we can do to help us get there. This is basically the idea. Okay, I'm again in the way. Let me move myself over here. Oops. Maybe here. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about rationality and how rationality is different from sensation. On Aristotle's view, again, Aristotle has this very detailed and systematic view. So every kind of soul has its own virtues, and Aristotle talks about the rational virtues, or as the virtues of thought. These are the ways that the mind achieves truth in affirmation or denial. Virtue. So a virtue is when something is operating well. Virtue kind of sounds stuffy. You might think of virtues as excellences or as the best way. The Greek word for virtue is arete. So arete is the best of a kind. And you might think of the goal, the sort of telos that Aristotle says we're aimed at as being the best state. And so obviously we want to be in the best state because it's the best. And there's different ways of getting there. There's different ways of controlling our rational capacities. There's different ways of controlling our animal capacities in order to achieve these idealized virtues, these idealized ends. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about the virtues of thought. These are the way that thinking goes well, or thinking renders itself good, functions well. And there's 5 different virtues of thought that Aristotle talks about: episteme, techne, phronesis, nous, and sophia. We've already mentioned sophia when we're talking about philosophers. This is wisdom. Philosophia is lovers of wisdom. The first 2 cases here are maybe most talked about after Aristotle, episteme and techne. Episteme is it's a Greek word for knowledge, and it's quite popular to use this word talking about knowledge today, especially in the academy. You might hear people talk about epistemology. Epistemology is just the study of knowledge. For Aristotle, epistemology is the study of a particular kind of knowledge. For Aristotle, epistemology is the study of scientific knowledge, or what he calls scientific knowledge. And what Aristotle means by scientific knowledge is not really what we mean by it. He doesn't really have empirical science to draw from. Instead, for Aristotle, scientific knowledge, like the word science it's a Latin word, but it means knowledge. And so when Aristotle's talking about epistemic knowledge, he's talking about knowledge that you can derive from logical arguments. So I mentioned earlier that Aristotle develops this whole logic system. His logic is categorical logic. You can see an example of categorical logic here. All cats are mammals. All mammals are animals. So if we know it's true that all cats are mammals, that all cats are members of the category mammals, and we also know it's true that all mammals are members of the category animals, because of these categorical relationships, we can derive other bits of knowledge. Like we can derive that if all cats are mammals and all mammals are animals, that all cats are also animals. That if this set is in this set and this set is in this set, then this set must be in this set. And this is a bit of deductive knowledge, right? The way Aristotle's thinking about it is that I've now deduced a new fact of the world: all cats are animals. And I've deduced this from two other facts that I already knew and their logical structure, right? The sort of categorical relationships. So this is how Aristotle thinks science works. Aristotle thinks science is a matter of deductively deriving arguments and conclusions on the basis of these sort of categorical relationships. So science is just making these kinds of logical deductions, and one way we help science along is by figuring out all the categories of things. What are all the things that exist? What categories are they a part of? And how do those categories relate to each other? And this is how we start generating scientific knowledge. So this is why Aristotle starts doing some of the first taxonomies of animals, like naming all the animals and grouping them into families, into groups, and figuring out how they're related to each other, because knowing those relationships in Aristotle's view is how we can deduce new truths about the world. We can learn new things through science with this sort of deductive method. Again, this is not how we think about science today. We think about science as experiment and observation and so on. It uses logic, but logic is not the core of it. But for Aristotle, it's really logic that's the foundation of scientific knowledge. But Aristotle realizes that this is not the only kind of knowledge. Aristotle also talks about craft knowledge, or techne. This is where we get the word technology. And for Aristotle, craft knowledge is about the skills that a craftsperson needs to build a thing. So when we were talking about the table earlier, that the carpenter is using his or her skills to put the wood together into the shape of the table, and it's that technical knowledge, that artisanal knowledge, the craft knowledge that the artist has, that the carpenter has, that allows them to build the artifact, the table. So Aristotle recognizes that this kind of craft knowledge, these skills, these learned skills, are different from logical deductions. That you can't logically deduce a learned skill. It's not enough to read a logical argument in order to teach me how to do woodworking. To do woodworking, I need to do a lot of practice. And it's this kind of built up, habituated practice that really teaches someone these technical skills. So modern philosophers would distinguish between, the way we talk about this nowadays is that we talk about the difference between knowing how versus knowing that. So knowing that is like knowing facts, like knowing specific bits of scientific knowledge. You know that the capital of the United States is in Washington, D.C., for instance. Knowing that is about knowing bits of propositional knowledge that can be put into logical arguments. And it's the sort of thing that you can write in a textbook and transmit to other people. So that's the knowledge that is the epistemic or scientific knowledge. And that's supposed to be contrasted with knowledge how, which are the sort of embodied skills. So you can't reduce the craft of woodworking to a bunch of statements or propositions, do this after this or whatever. So there's more to the know-how than just knowing that. You can take a skill that you know and try to write down exactly what you do in the skill. For instance, if you know how to drive, try to write down the exact procedure that you use for managing the car. Maybe you can do it. Maybe it'll take a little bit of work, but it's probably not what's literally going through your head as you're driving, these sort of statements of what to do in what situation. Instead, your reaction is a lot more embodied and intuitive when you have this kind of skill. Or maybe if you don't like driving, something like shooting a free throw. Even someone who's really good at shooting a free throw, even a professional basketball player, will have a hard time stating in propositional form, in sentence form, exactly what they're doing when. A lot of the skill of knowing how to shoot that free throw is in the body. It's in muscle memory. It's in the practice, and it's not in just a bunch of sentences. So you can't write down knowing how. I cannot learn how to ride a bike from reading a book. Maybe reading a book can help me appreciate things about riding a bike, but to know how to ride a bike, I need to have the skill of knowing how to ride a bike. I need to practice riding bikes. Okay, so this epistemic and technical knowledge is a fundamental distinction in Aristotle. And one of the things Aristotle says is that scientific knowledge can get at the truth, but craft knowledge doesn't get at the truth. Craft knowledge is practical. Craft knowledge has other ends besides the truth. For instance, some people learn crafts to make money, not to get at the truth. So craft knowledge is different from the rest of these virtues of thought in the sense that there is a way that craft knowledge can function well, but its functioning well does not aim at the truth, at least doesn't always aim at the truth. So technical knowledge is a little bit suspicious for that reason. For Aristotle, the centerpiece of his theory of the mind here is intelligence, or the Greek word here is phronesis. Intelligence person in Aristotle's view accomplishes what they set out to achieve. They do. They have practical intelligence in the sense that they can accomplish things. The practical person does what's best in order to accomplish those things. So, like for instance, if my goal is to be a doctor, a medical doctor, but I spend literally all of my time playing video games and watching Netflix, and I never spend any time studying or whatever. So maybe I have the goal of being a doctor, but maybe I'm not being very intelligent about how to achieve that goal. If I want to be a doctor, I need to practice and study, and there's a lot of effort that goes into the training. And if I don't put that effort in, then I'm not going to do well at being a doctor. I mean, you might think that if someone wants to be a doctor, but they never spend any time studying and they spend all their time playing video games, that they really don't want to be a doctor. That maybe they're just saying that, but that's not really what they want, because they're not really committed to those goals. Because if you were really committed to those goals and you were intelligent at all, then you would be doing things to achieve those goals. If you have goals that you're not doing anything to achieve, then in what sense are they really your goals? So an intelligent person does what's necessary to achieve their goals. They are thoughtful about what they're doing and how they relate to their goals. And so intelligent people can improve on their actions. Intelligent people don't just do what they're habituated to do, but they think about what they're doing and do what's best. In this sense, you might think that animals can be intelligent in some sense, in the sense that animals might also be doing what's best to achieve their goals. Like my cat chasing a mouse. Like there's a way of being really bad at chasing a mouse, and there's a way of being good at chasing the mouse. And as my cat gets better at chasing the mouse, better at cornering it and stopping it in its tracks and so on, you might think that this is the cat getting more and more intelligent because it's better able to achieve its goals. You might also see where the word intelligence comes in artificial intelligence. And when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about machines that just know a lot of facts or have any particular skill. It's also not machines that have any conscious experience. What we're really talking about with intelligence is machines that can achieve certain goals, that you give them a task and that machine can complete that task. And in the sense that they make good decisions in the process of completing a task is precisely what it would mean for an artificial intelligence system to be intelligent. So we'll come back to this notion of intelligence as phronesis later in the semester. One more thing to point out besides wisdom that we've already talked about is understanding. Understanding more than intelligence, understanding ends up being the sort of philosophical hobby horse that philosophers are really concerned about whether or not machines understand what they're doing. And the idea here is not just can the machines perform the logical operations to do the right thing. In some sense, maybe you can get logical operations. You can perform enough logical operations to do something that appears intelligent. Like for instance, a chess-playing computer has to do a lot of deductive logic in order to figure out what the best move is next. And that's a lot of basically mathematics, but maybe the result is a move that's pretty good. And so maybe there's some sense in which the machine is acting intelligently. But what a lot of philosophers are going to put their foot down and say, but the machine's not really doing that, is they're going to say the machines are not really understanding. That even if the chess playing program can play really smart chess in the sense that it's making good moves and it's beating its opponents, Some philosophers might say, but even still, the computer doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't understand what it's doing. It doesn't really understand why winning is important or what it means to win. It doesn't feel the rush of winning a game. Right? And this kind of understanding of the game is not something that you can program into a computer. So this is an Aristotelian view. This view goes all the way back to Aristotle. For Aristotle, understanding is precisely the kind of thing that you can't teach. Understanding for Aristotle is understanding of first principles. First principles of logic, for instance. So earlier I gave you this deductive logic argument: all cats are mammals, all mammals are animals, therefore all cats are animals. And to some extent, you just see that that's the case with the relationship between the categories. Like, I can give you more scientific knowledge by giving you specific relationships between specific categories. But before you see how that works in the argument, you first have to understand just the very general framework of the argument, that if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then all A's are C's. And that kind of logical relationship, Aristotle thinks you can't teach that. You either have it or you don't. Aristotle thinks that we all have it, or most of us have it, because we're rational human beings. And in virtue of our rationality, we can grasp these deep first principles that make reasoning possible. But a cat doesn't have those first principles. There's nothing you can say to the cat or teach the cat that'll make it understand that if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then all A's are C's. Like, that's just sort of outside of the cat's purview. There's no possible grasp on those first principles, which is just to say the cat doesn't understand. The cat doesn't understand logic. The understanding here is not just about facts. It's not just about skills. It's not just about doing the right thing in the right circumstance, but it's something deeper. It's this fundamental access to these deep first principles. All right. So these are all important for how Aristotle's thinking about rational creatures like us. They're important for understanding how maybe even today we're thinking about knowledge and technology. And also these terms, intelligence and understanding, will come up when we talk about arguments over artificial intelligence. So just keep this in the back of your mind. The next little unit, the next little collection of slides here. Let me get myself out of the way again. Sorry. The next little collection of slides here is actually taken from my engineering ethics classes. So if you go into Canvas and the reading list, there'll be a little section for my engineering ethics classes. This is the virtue ethics slide deck, or a little piece of the virtue ethics slide deck from my engineering ethics class. I talk about virtue ethics and, in fact, all the ethical theories, or the three popular ethical theories: virtue ethics and consequentialism and deontology. I give introductions to these in my engineering ethics class, and all of that material is available to this class. If you're interested in the ethics stuff, I strongly recommend you go back and look at that material. The important part for our purposes, we've already said some of this, is that the virtues are concerned with what's best. So Aristotle is not only putting together a conception of what it means to be human, or what the purpose of humanity is, but also how to be ethical and how to be a good person, or how to be an excellent person. So the virtues are concerned with what's best, and if we want to live the good life, we'll try to do what's best. This is Aristotle's idea. This is sort of the way that Aristotle's thinking about it. So what is the best? Well, best really depends on the kind. So different kinds might have different what counts as best. What's good for my cat is not what's good for me. So in order to understand what's virtuous for a thing, you have to understand what kind of thing it is. For Aristotle, there's no hard and fast rules for figuring out what's best. Like, there's no cheat sheet for always doing the best thing or always doing the most ethical thing. Ethics is hard precisely because it's so ambiguous about what's good, and because what's good differs so dramatically between different people and different kinds of things. So Aristotle wants you, again, remember pointing out at the earth, Aristotle wants you to be focused on practical situations, situations of practical knowledge, and to look to examples of people acting well for tips and tricks. So, for instance, Aristotle would like something like Goofus and Gallant. If you've ever seen these old cartoon shows in Highlights magazine, Goofus and Gallant are supposed to be examples of. So Goofus is the bad kid, and he does bad things. And sometimes the things aren't really bad, but they're just like sort of bad character traits. Like, he didn't really do anything wrong, but maybe you're kind of a jerk for doing it that way. So Goofus bosses his friends. like he didn't commit an illegal act, and maybe it wasn't even a purely unethical act, but maybe it makes Goofus a sort of bad character, the kind of person you don't want to be around. So Goofus bosses his friends, whereas Gallant asks, "What do you want to do next?" Gallant is open to listening to his friends and so on. And so the point here of these little cartoons is that Goofus demonstrates the bad way and Gallant demonstrates the good way. And they're not telling you do this or don't do that, but they're giving you examples of what's good and what's bad. And you're supposed to be able to see just by looking at the examples why you would prefer to be more like Gallant rather than Goofus. Goofus takes the last apple, whereas Gallant shares his orange. Like maybe if you just want your apples, then you act more like Goofus. But part of the point of the comic is that you'll be better off and people will like you more if you act more like Gallant. So this is the general idea of Aristotle's virtue ethics: is you want to do the best things, and that the best things in some sense are self-motivating. If you really understood and thought about what you want your life to be, then you'd realize that doing these best things are really in your best interest. As I said earlier, Aristotle is not unique in these views, and Aristotle to some extent inherits these views from earlier theories. Confucius has a much earlier version of this kind of virtue ethics approach. In China, it may be helpful to contrast some of the things that Confucius says with what Aristotle says. So Confucius's virtue ethics is really focused on social roles. And in fact, a lot of what Confucius says about ethics is modeled on the ideal family. So on Confucius's idea is that the different members of the family have a different role to play in keeping the family healthy and well. The mother plays a role and the father plays a role. The child plays a different role than both the mother and father. The grandparents play different roles, and aunts and uncles and so on. Right? And the idea is that all of these different positions in the family have a specialized role to play. And so it's important that each of the participants in the family play their role and do their best in their role, because that helps the entire family structure. And just as there are roles in the family, Confucius thinks that there are roles in society more generally, like the roles of the politicians or the administrative leaders of a city have a special role in the city, and therefore they have special obligations that maybe other citizens don't have. And so a lot of what Confucius says is not just wagging his finger at people to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing, but he's really mostly talking to administrators and politicians and government leaders and trying to tell them how to run a good city. And he's using the sort of model of the family as inspiration for running the good city. So one of the things that the leaders should do on Confucius's view is to lead through excellence. So if the leaders are doing a bunch of bad things, then the people will follow the leaders and also do bad things. And if the leaders punish people for doing bad things while doing bad things themselves, then the people will think that the leader's a hypocrite and they won't follow anything they say. But Confucius says if the leaders are doing good things, if the leaders are acting in virtuous ways, then the people will see and recognize those virtues and will act virtuously as well. That they will see that they'll take their cues from their leaders. And so it's really important for the leaders to act virtuously because that's where everyone else is getting their cues. Okay, so you can see a similar framework in this sort of Confucius story where there's different social roles, differentiated functional roles that everyone plays, and that the overall system works well when all the roles are playing their parts. Aristotle has a similar view. Maybe that view of everyone playing their proper role is a little bit closer to Plato's view in the Republic. But Aristotle has a similar view. But one of the things that Aristotle really emphasizes is habits. So Aristotle says that virtue is not an act but a habit, or correct habituation distinguishes a good political system from a bad one. So on Aristotle's view, we are creatures of habit. We act habitually. We don't always think before we act, but we tend to do what we've sort of trained ourselves to do. Like, for instance, when I take a shower in the morning, there's like an order that I wash my hair first, and then I wash my arms second, and so on. There's like an order that I do all the steps in the shower. and then when I get out, I brush my teeth first, and so on. And so there's an order, and I tend to every single time when I get in the shower go run through that same order. It's really how I make sure that I complete all the steps is by going through that order. Sometimes I might miss a step, and then I sort of get confused about the whole thing because I'm not making the choice every single time by a conscious decision that next I'll wash my legs. Like, this is not a conscious decision every time. Instead, it's sort of this habit that I've built up, and I just sort of go through the motions. And Aristotle actually thinks that this is a good thing, that what we want is to be virtuous by habit. Like if our virtues required really hard thinking ahead of time and really hard deliberation ahead of time, then it'd be a lot harder to be virtuous. And the ideal situation is when we've developed a habit of virtue so that being virtuous just comes naturally to us. We just sort of do the right thing all the time. And so whether or not you're virtuous is really a reflection of your character, the kind of person that you are. So Aristotle realizes that good people do bad things sometimes and bad people do good things sometimes. And so you can't judge people on individual actions. Not only do sometimes good people do bad things, everyone makes mistakes, but also making those mistakes is important to learning. And you only improve your ethical character by making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. So Aristotle is not going to condemn people based on individual actions. He really wants to evaluate people based on their character, based on the habits that they have. And so someone who's developed a habit of always telling the truth is going to find it easier to tell the truth in the future. Someone who struggles to tell the truth does not have a good character. And notice that being honest is not something that you can only do sometimes and not other times. Like, if you have to say that you have an honest character means that you're telling the truth all the time. Someone who mostly tells the truth but sometimes lies, maybe sometimes lies really seriously, is not an honest person, even if they're mostly telling the truth. Those occasional lies become marks on the character. You've compromised your character by telling even just a few lies. So the best thing to do on Aristotle's view is to develop a habit of doing the virtuous thing, of never telling lies. And that'll make it easier in the future to do the better thing. And you want to do the better thing not because there's a heaven waiting for you. Aristotle is not believing in an afterlife in that sense. Not because there's any objective morality but that's telling you what to do. But because this will help you lead a good life, right? The acting virtuously is what gets you to living the good life, the happy, flourishing life. If you want to be like that flourishing garden, productive garden, producing fruit and so on, then you want to live the virtuous life. This is Aristotle's idea. There's more things to say about this, talking about moral luck and so on, that I go into in the engineering ethics lecture. I really just want to tie this all back around, though, that Aristotle thinks that so again, there's no rule book for being virtuous. There's no set of commands that if you follow these commands, you will always be virtuous and always live the good life. It's a lot more ambiguous than that. And so Aristotle instead has this procedure for sort of figuring out what the virtuous action is. And it's this, unsurprisingly, it's this process of finding a balance, where there's these sort of extremes, and you want to find a balance between these extremes. Aristotle calls this the golden mean, or the middle way. And this is not just Aristotle's view, but this Confucius has a version of this kind of view. This is rather common throughout the ancient Silk Road philosophies, this idea that what's best is what's balanced, or that what's best is what's moderate between two extremes. So for Aristotle, the virtue is between the extremes. So this is an example of different virtues and their extremes. So every virtue is the middle position between two extremes. So for instance, the virtue of courage, to be courageous, to be brave. This is the middle position, Aristotle thinks, between a deficiency of courage, when you're a coward, when you don't have enough courage, you're a coward, or when you have too much courage. And this is someone who's rash. Rashness is when you act hastily. So you can imagine, like, there's a burning building, and maybe you see that there's a kid on the second story of the burning building. What do? Well, the rash person sees the kid and immediately runs into the building, and they don't really think about what they're doing. They don't think about whether the building's safe to run into. Maybe the building collapses immediately after you run into it and everyone dies. So the rash person sort of just runs headlong into danger and doesn't think about what they're doing. The coward turns away from danger and runs away and going into the house at all. But on Aristotle's view, neither of these are the virtuous position. The virtuous position is the middle position. The virtuous person thinks about what's appropriate and does the right thing in the right way for the right reason, without excess. So the courageous person might see that the building is just safe enough to run into, and then will run into the building. But the courageous person might instead see that the building is about to collapse, and it's not the best thing to run in. What makes the person virtuous is that they did the best thing. And again, it's hard to see what that best thing is in advance. But if you see other examples of courageous people, other people doing courageous things, maybe you'll get a better idea of what courage amounts to. Aristotle thinks about the same basic thing, that the best way is the middle way, is the moderate position. So, for instance, drinking and partying. Aristotle is not going to say that you should never drink and party, or that you should always drink and party. But Aristotle is going to say that there's an appropriate amount of drinking and partying, right? Not too little, but not too much. You don't want to have too little, because then you're never going to be fun and you're never going to make friends. But you don't want to do too much where you're never getting anything done and you're sort of wasting your life partying. You want to find that proper middle ground where you're partying just enough to have a good life, but not too much. This is, you might think of it as the Goldilocks version of ethics. You remember Goldilocks goes into the bear's cabin, and there's the mama's bear's porridge is too cold, and the daddy bear's, or the papa bear's porridge is too hot, and the baby bear's porridge is just right. It's not too cold and not too hot, right? So same thing with Aristotle. The virtues are this middle position between the extremes, the Goldilocks version of ethics. And again, you can see that this is basically this yin yang view again. It's the idea that what's best is what's middle, what's moderate, what's balanced, what strikes the right balance and harmony. And so this is the overview of Aristotle's view. This is a very sketchy overview. I'm going really fast over a lot of really big topics. Any one of these topics you can dive down into more detail. But hopefully you can see here how Aristotle's grand metaphysics works, from the very basic questions about what exists and what makes a thing the thing it is, all the way through to how we should live our life and how we should live ethically. And then not only does Aristotle have a view on all these things, but the view is consistent throughout. It's because of the form of the human that our ethical lives take the shape they do. And if we were a different kind of thing, if we had different form and substance, that would shape a different sort of ethical framework. So top to bottom, the whole thing is all tied together. Again, you can study Aristotle's views for your entire life. Like this stuff is not easy. There's a lot to say here, and some of it is really difficult. Some of it might get you, might be exciting to you that you want to study further. I've just really sketched out a survey of the view so you can sort of focus in on what you find interesting. But hopefully from here you have a sense of what I'm thinking about with these architectonic thinkers, with these sort of big picture thinkers that are tying everything together in this unified framework. Because we're going to be going through a few more of these later on in the semester. Kant has another view like this. Maybe Hegel and Marx do also, but we won't talk about them. And I also want to talk about computation as this kind of overarching metaphysical framework. I want to talk about Turing's computers as giving an alternative to Aristotle's metaphysics. But we have a lot of things to do before we get there. And so what I want to end this video with, I've been talking for 2.5 hours already, but I still have a little bit to go. And this is just some criticisms of Aristotle. So I'm giving a lot of motivation for Aristotle. And I think hopefully on this view, maybe you recognize, or at least it sounds reasonable or even familiar, that there's these different kinds of souls, and this is what makes humans different from the animals, and the animals different from the plants, and the living creatures different from the other creatures. Like, hopefully this is more or less intuitive and understandable, even at this very high level. That you sort of see what's going on, or what Aristotle's sort of aiming at. But it's important to also understand this view is wrong. Like it's wrong in a lot of respects, and some of these respects are absolutely devastating to the picture. Maybe the biggest failure of Aristotle's view is just this basic distinction to the different types of substances. This is the difference between inanimate, animate, and eternal objects. Science does not recognize any such difference. Let me say this again. modern science does not recognize any distinction between the inanimate and the animate objects. There is no soul in the way that Aristotle uses the term that is recognized by modern science. Put another way, modern science rejects the Aristotelian notion of the soul and rejects that there's any special thing that makes the living creatures separate from the inanimate creatures. We're made of all the same stuff. And this is really what the scientific revolution is about, is that these metaphysical frameworks that informed the Aristotelian conception of the world and that distinguish the humans from the rest of the living things, and from the rest of the living things and distinguish the living things from the rest of the universe, that this basic framework is wrong, should be rejected. In fact, the same basic physical principles that move the inanimate objects are also moving the animate objects. And if you understood the processes of life, then you'd see how, in fact, this isn't a fundamental distinction. Maybe even more importantly, the eternal objects, the eternal objects are not moving according to different physical principles than the inanimate or the animate objects, that the laws of physics that govern the motion of the heavens, the motion of the stars and the sun and the moon, are the exact same physics that govern things here on Earth. The trajectory of a cannonball that I shoot out falls according to gravity, and that gravitational force is the exact same force that keeps the Earth around the sun and the moon around the Earth, and so on. All right, so these aren't fundamental differences in motion. In fact, there's only one kind of motion. It's just physics. And physics can explain all of this stuff. Yeah, so some things that Aristotle gets wrong in more detail. So one thing that Aristotle gets wrong is this idea of spontaneous generation. So Aristotle recognizes that there's reproductive, there's sexual reproduction, where a male and a female get together and reproduce an offspring. So Aristotle recognizes there's sexual reproduction, but he also thinks that there's another kind of reproduction, which he calls spontaneous generation. And this was a view that was believed in Aristotle's time and before Aristotle and still long after Aristotle. So people used to think that some living creatures spontaneously generated, that they came into existence from nothing or from a basic material. So for instance, people thought that insects could spontaneously generate from meat. So if you put a piece of meat out, that meat would spontaneously turn into flies. They would say the same thing about mice. Like if you left a pile of rags in the corner of the barn, that pile of rags would turn into a mouse. And the idea is that the generation here is spontaneous. So there's the raw material. So if you believe that a thing is just the material in some form, then maybe that form causes material to turn into certain things. So maybe somehow the form of the insect is being imprinted on the meat so that the meat can spontaneously turn into flies. People believed in spontaneous generation for a very, very long time. And it wasn't really sufficiently disproven until the modern scientific era, where people subjected the theory to rigorous experimentation. So even in the 1600s, you have people doing things like putting meat in a jar and then covering the jar and then seeing what happens. And that meat will still rot. There's still bacteria on it that'll decompose and decay that meat, but it'll never turn into flies unless there's already flies in there. We know nowadays that flies don't spontaneously appear from nowhere. Flies also are also produced by sexual reproduction, and that means that there's fly eggs somewhere. And so what people were missing from the meat being left out is that at some point when you weren't watching, two flies mated and left their eggs in the meat, and the maggots and flies that you see that come out of the meat came there because the eggs were left there by flies. And if you block access to the meat, then the meat will never turn into flies. So this is evidence that spontaneous generation doesn't occur. Definitive proof spontaneous generation was sort of laid to rest in 1859 by Louis Pasteur from pasteurization. And the idea of his experiments is he boiled some broth in a flask. In one flask, he left it open to the air, and after a few days, the broth was contaminated with bacteria. Another one, he put a cotton swab on the top, and no bacteria got into the broth. And the other one, he put this little loop on the mouth of the flask so it wasn't easy for things to get in. In this case, there was bacteria on the loop of the flask, but no bacteria was able to go all the way in to the broth, and so the broth also remained sterile. So these all is meant to prove that whatever is infecting the broth and making it infected with bacteria is coming from the outside. It's not already there, and it's not spontaneously generating from the material. So this idea of Aristotle's spontaneous generation is unproven, is disproven, and the disproof gives us reason to be skeptical of this matter-form relationship that drives Aristotle's hylomorphism. It's not the only reason. There's a lot of reasons here to be skeptical of Aristotle's view. Here's Aristotle's view of reproduction. So spontaneous generation is out, but even Aristotle's view of sexual reproduction is really weird, and it's based on his hylomorphic theory and his theory of the elements. So on his view, the father's semen provides heat, and the mother's womb, or the menses, I'm sorry, not just the womb, the menses, the menstrual fluid, provides cold. And so on Aristotle's view, the woman provides the raw matter for reproduction, and the man provides the form for reproduction. And so the semen provides heat and also provides form. And first, Aristotle thinks that if the heat is hot enough and it overpowers the cold from the woman, then you get a boy offspring. But if the heat is not hot enough and and the cold overpowers the heat, then you get a girl offspring. But either way, you're getting the form of the offspring from the father. So Aristotle's idea is that form comes from father and matter comes from mother. So the offspring is made from the material of the mother, but the form of the father. And so it's really only formal features being transmitted through the father. You're not getting formal features transmitted through the mother. And that means that the reproductive process is sort of asymmetric in this way, that you're getting things from the father you don't get from the mother. Obviously, this stuff is not true at all. Aristotle doesn't have any idea of genetics or of the genetics of reproduction. Another weird thing about Aristotle's view of reproduction is that he believes in telegony. Telegony is the view that previous mates that the mother had could influence future children. So if the mother had a mate from had a child from one father, the next and another child from a different father, that second child might inherit traits from the first father, from the father of the first child. Those traits sort of stick around in the mother and might influence future offspring. This is a view that was taken seriously for a very long time, well into the modern era. In fact, this kind of view was used to justify anti-race mixing policies. Right? The idea is that if someone has a child from offspring from parents of one race, and then the mother has offspring from a father of a different race, that some of the race of the first father might impact the second child and future children. And so this concern about race mixing was used to justify the treatment of the reproductive processes, the biology of the reproductive processes. Again, Aristotle's view here is completely wrong on the mechanics of the biology. The racist ideas are also wrong. We know nowadays that telegony is not true, that there's no traits it's the sperm and an egg that's part of the sexual reproduction, and it's not prior sperm from prior mates that helps the reproductive process. So prior mates don't matter for future offspring. But this is, again, something that was not really understood until the modern era, until modern genetics. And this is just Aristotle's problem with reproduction. Aristotle has all sorts of other problems with how he talks about women. And interestingly, his discussion of women in politics and in ethics is not directly related to his discussion of female reproduction, sort of the contribution of females to reproduction. But there is a relationship here, and Aristotle says all sorts of weird and uncomfortable things about women. Here's a quote from the Politics. Aristotle says, Aristotle also believes that there are natural slaves, that some people are naturally slaves, and the natural slaves lack the rational deliberative element. In other words, the slaves are more like animals. Aristotle recognizes that women have a deliberative element. They're sort of rational, but they lack authority in their rationality. So they're sort of pseudo-rational or not quite rational, and similar in some ways to a child. So the women are similar in some ways to a child and similar in other ways to a slave on Aristotle's view. Obviously, this is sort of deeply misogynistic, and some of the misogyny really just doesn't make sense. Like Aristotle's very worried about the sort of biological study of all these living creatures, but for some reason in Aristotle's books, he says that women have fewer teeth than men. And that's not true. Women have the same amount of teeth as men, and you would think that to learn that you just have to count the teeth in some people's mouths. But apparently Aristotle never did that, or he did it with biased samples, so that he thinks that women have fewer teeth than men. Again, this is not true, and it's an example of where Aristotle's science here is really falls below the threshold of acceptability. But in addition to just getting the biological facts wrong, Aristotle has all these other ideas about women's capacity for rationality, women's capacity for political engagement, women's capacity for science. This stuff is definitely worth engaging. Again, I'm not at all telling you to take Aristotle as a correct metaphysics, and I think maybe questioning Aristotle's misogyny here can be helpful in understanding how these views developed over time. So I have some of the links in the readings. This is a general discussion in the Stanford Encyclopedia on feminist takes in the history of philosophy, where this quote comes from. So these are all, again, problems with Aristotle. Here's another kind of problem with Aristotle. And maybe it's not really a problem with Aristotle, but maybe with the legacy of Aristotelianism. And this is the problem of vitalism. So maybe this is not Aristotle's view directly. Remember, Aristotle doesn't believe that there's like a special ghost or a special substance that makes you you. But this is really the view of the vitalists, and vitalists inherit a lot of their views from this sort of Aristotelianism. So I have an article from Bill Bechtel on vitalism, where he defines vitalism as just the view that living organisms are fundamentally different from non-living organisms, in that they contain some non-physical element or something that's governed by principles other than standard physics. So if you believe in a spiritual soul that will survive the death of your body and live on in eternity in the afterlife, right? This is a kind of vitalist principle, because however that soul works cannot be explained by the physical properties of the body. Right? It's somehow that it operates in some way fundamentally different from the rest of the physical things. Now, vitalism is a view that we know is wrong today. There is no vital force or vital spirit, the so-called élan vital, that animates living creatures. There's no separate substance that makes living creatures alive and different from non-living creatures. Science today rejects the idea of any vital spirit. But for a long time, vitalists were like the best going theory of biology. If you already accept the sort of Aristotelian background framework, then it might make sense that there's some vital force that makes the living things different from the non-living things. And people believed this for a long time, and it really motivated a lot of early biology and early science into life. But nowadays, we reject this view. There is no vital force. And we know this is true because we can build life from scratch. We can literally take organic molecules, organic compounds like amino acids, and mix them together in the right proportion to build something that's alive. So we can take non-living parts and mix them together in the right sort of way to get a living organism that grows and reproduces and dies just like any other living organism. We did this for the first time back in 2008. This is Craig Ventner. Craig Ventner is a controversial figure, but he's the guy who helped complete the Human Genome Project, and where we sequenced all of the human genetic code. But Craig Ventner is also known for what's called synthetic biology, which is making organisms from scratch. So back in 2008, he took a bacteria that is sort of easy to grow in the lab. They sequence its entire genetic code, so they know the entire genetic sequence. And then in genetics labs and biology labs, you can order from like a catalog different parts of DNA, different sort of sequences of DNA that you can build chemically. And so what they did is they just ordered a bunch of these chemicals from a catalog, and then they matched it up with the sequence from the organism. And then in order to build strands of DNA, you can take a form of yeast and then swap little bits of DNA into the yeast genetic code. And then so when the yeast reproduces, it reproduces that part of the genetic code. And so you can build these specialized yeast that will build genetic code for you. So you take the raw chemicals, little pieces of DNA, and you give them to these yeast to start stitching them together. And you have to do this thousands of times. The DNA in this is something like 10,000 or 80,000 base pairs, something like that. So it's this long strand of DNA. But you can get these yeast to build, to take the raw chemicals and stitch them together and to build that long strand of DNA. And then once you have the long strand completely built, you can put that into a blank cell and then turn the cell on, and the cell starts reproducing like it was a normal living creature. So we've been able to make living systems from scratch, from basic non-living parts, for over a decade, since at least 2008. In fact, Craig Ventner has gone on from this. So to go even further, so the original experiment was using a strand of genetic code taken from an existing organism that we sequenced, and then reconstructing that as a synthetic process to build a synthetic organism. Later on in 2016, Craig Ventner took that same organism and decided to see how small it could make the genome. So it started just knocking out genes selectively to see how many of the genes it could remove and still get a viable organism. So I think the original organism had something like 500 genes, and the revised organism has something like 300 or 370 or something genes. So it has fewer genes than any other organism. This was already one of the most simplest organisms that had the smallest genome. And then we were able to make that genome even smaller than any organism that we know about. So this is a genome, this little picture up here in C. This is the minimal genome in 2016, where they made a version of this that was even smaller, has even smaller genetic code, but that was still viable and reproduced. So we've built entirely novel organisms from scratch, from the bottom up. And this stuff has become pretty popular recently. Nowadays, it's called bottom-up synthetic biology, where you're building all of the parts and pieces of the cell. Maybe you're putting technological spins on some of these pieces, but that you're building all of the mechanical parts of the cell from scratch and building it up. So because we can build a cell from scratch and have it be a completely living organism, and we know we didn't put any vital force in there, we know we didn't put any special magic to make it alive, that it's all just these basic organic compounds mixed together in the right way and to create a functional organism. So because we can do this in the lab, we know with very high confidence that there is no independent soul, there is no vital force. Like sometimes you see like these stories about that the soul weighs 21 grams, and that when someone dies that they lose their soul, their body also loses 21 grams of weight or whatever. All of that stuff is just bullshit. It's not real. And we know it's not real because we can build living organisms from basic parts. So the extent to which Aristotle's view of form and matter give rise to this kind of vitalist conception of life, we just know that it's wrong. And this is the last slide. But Aristotle's view of how the different things relate to each other and how the different parts of the soul relate to each other and so on, nevertheless becomes very influential over time in medicine, in science, but also in religion. As I said in the introduction video, that St. Thomas Aquinas takes up Aristotle and adapts it to the Christian theology, and sort of integrates both so Aristotle becomes the philosopher of the natural world. Aristotle explains how the natural world works, and then the Bible explains how the world of the divine works, the theological world, the realm of God. And so Aquinas builds on top of Aristotle. So it basically takes all of Aristotle's system and then builds on top of it this sort of religious shell to make it compatible with Christianity. And that's why maybe if we go back here to Aristotle's virtues and vices, if any of you are Catholic, this will seem very familiar to you, because the Catholic religious tradition basically just takes Aristotle's ethics and adapts it to Christianity. This is a very simplified version of simplified understanding of the world, highly simplified, and it's just again just wrong in many respects. So one way that it's wrong, this sort of natural hierarchy of being, that's very obvious, and we'll talk about this a lot more next time, is that Earth. So on Aristotle's view, Earth goes down, and so Earth is in the center of the cosmos because the natural place of Earth is at the center. And so this is why Earth and things fall. This is why my pen falls, for instance. But it's also why the Earth is at the center of the cosmos and everything sort of revolves around the Earth. And so then elemental theory doesn't just explain the physics that we see around us, but it also explains the sort of structure of the cosmos. That Earth is at the center and the water's on top of that and so on. And this sort of structure of the cosmos based on the elemental theory also helps structure the whole structure of being. So this is called the Great Chain of Being. This is an image of the Great Chain of Being. And the Great Chain of Being is just the view that nature is organized from lower beings to higher beings, with the demons and the devils at the bottom. And then above that, you have like the minerals, and then the plants, and then the animals, and like maybe the simple lower animals like snakes and cows and whatever, and then maybe higher animals on top of that. Here's fish and birds. Maybe the birds are the most sort of divine of the animals, and so they're like in a strata all their own. But then above the birds and above all the other animals are the people, or the humans. And then maybe even among the humans, there's a division between the lowly slaves, or the women, or the kings, and the higher ranks, the priests and so on. And then the humans, though, are just sort of the middle of this chain. Above the humans are the angels, and then the archangels, and then all the way to God at the very top of this ladder. And the idea is that the natural world is arranged in this hierarchy, and so understanding the hierarchy, understanding how different parts are related to each other, tells you what's good for things, tells you how to live life, tells you how the world works. Right? And so the reason that women are subjugated and oppressed, or the reason that we keep slaves, is not just because we want to, not just because it's convenient for us, but because it's part of the natural order of the world. It's part of the structure of the cosmos, that certain people are just naturally slaves, and certain people are just naturally irrational, and other people are naturally rational people, and those are the people we should keep in charge of the city. Again, I don't believe any of this, and I don't think any of you should believe any of this. In fact, I think these kinds of beliefs end up having a really serious negative consequence on culture coming afterwards. It's this idea of a great chain of being that eventually works its way into the idea of a hierarchy of races. In the early scientific revolution, the racial hierarchies that develop from colonialism and from slavery are partly the result of an exaggerated and elaborated view from Aristotle's. If you already believe that the world takes the form of this natural hierarchy, then it's not a huge leap to think that some races are higher than others, and some races or some genders are higher than others. So I think there are a lot of things to like about Aristotle. There are a lot of things that are compelling and interesting, and that are worth studying more. But there are also a lot of problems with Aristotle, and a lot of ways that his views are not just that they don't fit with the modern world, but that they really just don't have any place in an ethical system at all. This idea of natural slavery maybe being one, the view of women being another. So again, I'm not trying to endorse Aristotle. I'm not trying to say that we should all believe what Aristotle says. We should be thinking very critically about Aristotle, but we should also be thinking about the ways, even if we reject the view ourselves, we should be thinking about the ways that these historical views inform the modern conversation, the ways that these assumptions and these frameworks inform the way that we think about nature and natural world and so on. In the next video, the plan is to talk about the scientific revolution, which is to a large extent a rejection of this Aristotelian idea. So we're going to get rid of teleology. Teleology is the big thing that we're going to attack, but we're going to get rid of natural motion. We're going to really get rid of this whole hierarchy of being, because that's what physics does in the modern era. But I've been talking now for 3 hours. Holy shit. Okay, so I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to be talking so long. I think maybe these videos should be broken up into pieces, but I hope this video was instructive, and I hope there's things that you enjoyed, and I hope we can talk about this in class soon. All right, thank you very much. Bye.